All right. Hey, and John, does Mike Levy need to kick off the meeting tonight and open it up?
No, that's a retreat.
I can do that. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And you can see me. Good evening. We're kicking off the budget meeting tonight. It's 6 p.m. July 2020. See, Amy called me and said she was going to be a little bit late. She's en route. So we'll let her join when she comes. Ben, I believe you have the podium today, or John, do you have anything to say?
I will, Duncan Rose and Chris Burkett are going to be more or less running tonight's meeting, moderators, and I would encourage council members or staff at any point, please, they don't have any problem being interrupted and answering questions as we go through. For 4 of you, this is brand new, and these are the experts, and Ben and I are here also to throw in our 2 cents. So please, this is all free-flowing, and ask questions as we go along, and we'll get through this just great. These guys did this for us last year. I felt it went extremely well, and I asked them to come back, and they've improved it this year, so we'll see what they have. With that, I'll turn it over to Duncan and Chris.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to say good evening, welcome to everyone. A little background, in 2019, your city manager, John Dougherty, invited Duncan Rose and I to do a presentation on governmental budgeting and beginning to take the first steps towards accepted best practices in financial management. This, of course, came in the wake of incomplete audits from 2016, 17, and 18. And in 2019, your new finance director, Ben Burkett, identified that not only were the audits incomplete, but that embezzlement had occurred along with poorly kept financial books. This has created financial accounting issues for the city and headaches for John and Ben, trying to correct numerous years of accounting issues, identifying embezzlement accounts, working with our insurance carrier, the CBI, and yet trying to be timely and complete to provide council with the information that they need and they want to be able to operate. These issues have led your city manager and staff to identify the governmental best practices need to be instilled, and that keeping city council up to date, involved, and educated are a necessary step. This session tonight is the first step with the City Council of 2020. Please, like John said, feel free to raise your hand, ask questions at any point in time. Duncan and I certainly do not mind being interrupted to clarify something, especially if we're not being clear on it. We are using a bit of a military training style in that we'll first tell you what you'll be hearing, then we'll tell you what you're hearing, and then finally we'll review what you heard. So we're trying to reinforce and make sure that we're bringing clarity to a lot of what we're presenting this evening. Next slide. This is our agenda for the evening. First, I'll introduce who Duncan and I are. And then in this first work session, we'll be talking about setting financial management context, basics of best practice municipal finance, financial management. And then Ben will go into budget context. And finally, we'll all talk a little bit about the summary of takeaway points and actions, perhaps. And then right at the moment, we're still talking and thinking about doing a work session 2 at another date, and we'll talk about that at the end. Next slide. Duncan Rose, the gentleman that I've met through Dolores River Anglers. He and I are both fly fishermen. Duncan has an education. He has a BA in economics and business, has an MS in urban and regional planning, and an MA in public and sector management, or in public sector management. He was in the U.S. Army, graduated from the U.S. Army Officers Candidate School in Combat Engineering, the Adjutant General of 172nd Light Infantry Brigade in Alaska. He had 15 years of senior management in Ohio Department of Natural Resources, Public Works Office, Columbus, Ohio. It was City Manager's Office in Dallas, Texas. Was Assistant County Administrator for Gainesville, Florida. Was the County Administrator for Seminole County in Orlando area. He also had a business that he was 25 years nationally and internationally as a management consultant in local government finance, municipal operations, business processes, and infrastructure asset management best practices. So he's got a lot of history to bring and information to bring along the best practices line. He also taught graduate governmental financial management at Florida State University for 9 years and co-author of 4 technical textbooks. Past and current local boards he's been on: Cortez Cultural Center, currently on the Montezuma Land Conservancy, and he's a board member of the Dolores River Anglers Chapter of Trout Unlimited. He's also on the Dolores Watershed Resiliency Forest Collaboration. As for myself, I have a BA in Physical Education and Anthropology from Fort Lewis College, a Colorado Teacher's Certificate of the Teaching Assistant at the University of Wyoming, and received a Master's in Parks and Recreation Administration from University of Wyoming. I have 48 years of senior management, recreation supervisor and superintendent in Yuma, Arizona, Parks and Recreation Director in Somerton, Arizona, and then the Director of Parks and Recreation for the City of Cortez for about 28 years. And then I moved over to grant administration with the City of Cortez. I've been with the city approximately 42 years. The last 7 or so, I've been working as a private sector consultant and working with the city on doing primarily grant administration. I also worked for a couple of years with the Economic Development Association, MECADA. I helped them get their feet on the ground and moving forward. I've also been a grants consultant working with the municipal and nonprofit sector of the community, with the town of Dolores, the hospital district, the museum board, and several others. And I am currently on the Dolores River Anglers Chapter of Trout Unlimited. So that's just a little background of who we are and where we're coming from. Next slide. The first section that we're going to talk about is setting the financial management context. We will provide some background on city budgeting process, talk about who is responsible for the budget, talk about what the budget is, what council should know about budget approval, and about a continuation budget. So a little brief history on where the city has come from to be where it is currently. When I first showed up with the City of Cortez in 1978, we were primarily doing category budgeting, and over the years it's moved to, thank you, next slide. Moved to line items. It's going from general to specific items and being more specific about what it is that we're actually proposing in our budgets. We went from a yearly to a 2-year, and then went from a 2-year to a multi-year, and from no vision to revisioning. Sometime in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years before John got here, though, I think things changed a little bit in that things got a little more general and not quite as specific. We used to have to turn in budgets that identified, as an example, for softball, we had put down how many umpires there were, how many trophies you bought, how many softballs. You itemized everything to show where your expenses were going. I'm not sure that that's being done anymore. The budgeting process is a fluid endeavor that focuses on investing in the community. It's not just about spending the monies that come in, and it's not just a plan that staff comes up with. It comes from city council that gives us direction. And when we talk about the continuation budget here in a little bit, I'll go more into that to give you an idea of where we are currently. When I do a grant writing budget, that's just a little different because the grantors are wanting to see cost development. What's the cost of not only operating, but maintaining or managing the grant that you're operating? They want to know what's the projected funding. Where are all those dollars coming from? So is it all their money? Is it half their money, half your money, whatever it may be? And they also want to know if you're just billing something that's in a phase project, so that they want to know, are we getting it done this year, or are you going to be back next year to ask for more money? And they also want to know, what happens if we don't fund you? Is that project going to fail, not be funded, not move forward? You're going to come back again next year, whatever. So there are different ways when you start looking at budgeting. There are different ways of getting someplace depending on what the outcome is that the operator is trying to achieve. So in other words, with a municipal budget, you're planning everything for all the services that you're providing and where you're going to be by the end of the year. With a project, when you're writing for a grant, they want to know some of the history behind it, who's funding it, where that money's coming from, etc. One of the other things is that 95% of all grants require matching funds from the applicant in dollars, equal to 20 to 50% of the project. So it's not always a matter that, oh, we can come up with matching funds where we're doing in-kind services, such as we're providing all the dump trucks, backhoes, people to do the work. They always want to see some dollars also. It's not just equipment or in-kind services that you can provide. And they want to know that the project you're proposing is in your master plan or conceptual plan. It's not just something that you go, oh, I read there's this grant available for funding new sidewalks, but it's not in our master plan anywhere. So, well, let's just see if we can get some of the money. They're not real keen on that type of thing. They want to know that it's something you're planning on, something that you're wanting to do, have been wanting, or have been wanting to do. And it's not just a spur of a moment. Next slide, please. Out of the city's code, one of the things that you can see, powers of council, is adopt the budget of the city. So when you take a look at the budget, this is council's budget. It's not John's, it's not the city managers, it's not staff, it's not the department heads. It's based upon what it is council has directed them to do and what they expect them to achieve. Next slide. Oh, one too far. Thank you. So as you can see, city council's budget is probably the most important document that you develop because it drives what the city does. It drives where the city is going. It drives where the expenses are going to be placed. It drives what the revenues need to be. It's a legal document that gives your staff, your officials, the authority to buy and go into debt, etc., to make sure that the services that the city and council wants to be provided are paid for. It's a management plan. It allocates limited resources amongst all the departments. And that's one of the things that you need to remember is that you have not had a chance yet to have a retreat to direct your city manager, your staff of where you are wanting to go. So the budget that is coming up before you this year is primarily based on the previous council and the directions that they started back in about 2017. So to be able to move forward, staff will need to know if there's differences on what you're wanting to do compared to what the previous council wanted to do. But this budget coming up is geared towards direction that they were given by them. And it's not just about the management plan. It controls how much departments get to spend, its strategies, its policies, and it sets the guidelines for how your departments are going to perform their budgets. It's not just financial data. Like I said, it represents goals and objectives, the overall city's mission statements, and it gives a wider vision of the future of where that municipality, where you're trying to take it. What do you want Cortez to be? Where do you expect it to be in 2030? And what are the steps that are going to take to get it there? The budget, though, is also an evaluation tool. You get to compare your commitments that you made in the budget to what did you actually accomplish. So if you're setting aside dollars for improving the water plant, did you actually improve the water plant this next year, let's say? Or for some reason, was there something that came up, you're expecting grant funds to match it up and those weren't available. So what did you achieve? If you didn't achieve it, why not? It's also a living document. You can be, council may modify it at any time. It's just that the budget must be adopted annually according to state statute guidelines. So you have some given guidelines by the state for when you have to submit a budget to them. Once adopted, council is responsible for budget oversight. In other words, you need to be asking questions. Did you spend the money where we expected you to spend it? Did we get the things that we wanted to get? Did we achieve the capital projects that we specified in the budget? Were they under budget? Were they over budget? And so when these things come up to you, you need to be asking. The bid that came in, is it above budget, below budget? If it's over budget, why? And where's that money coming from for the over budgeting, if you're going to approve it? Or are we going to lower the project or reduce the size of it? There's all those different things that you're needing to ask. Next slide, please. So some of the other things, what should council know in order to be able to move forward? You need to know, where do the revenues come from to fund the city? Is it all sales tax? How much of it is property tax? How much? Let's go away. Where's that money coming from? What are required? What are the different funds, and where do the revenues come from in order to move forward, and that go into specific funds? So some guidelines are, some of your funds are and expenses are set by legislation. So in other words, a certain percent of sales tax has to go to the water fund, has to go to the street fund. Some of it has to go for advertising, or some of it has to go to general fund. Some of it goes to equipment fund. You know, if things change, if your dollars don't come in and you're committed, where are you going to come up with those dollars in order to make sure that things that you've committed to long-term funding for, how are you going to pay for those if things change? You also need to know, what are the debts, short and long term? You know, when are they due to be paid off? If we pay it off early, may we actually save some money because the rates have gone down, or do we refinance it? So those are different things that you keep in mind when you're taking a look at what your debts are. The other thing that kind of drives this is, what are the city's services? You kind of need to know that, or begin to ask those questions of your departments. Well, Parks and Recreation, what do they do? Well, they provide parks. Okay, well, they provide playgrounds. They provide recreation services. You know, you expect them to mow the lawns, which drives another thing. Well, what's an established or acceptable service level? Do you expect those lawns to be mowed every week? Or is every other week fine? Or if you get in a time of tight money, maybe you start going, okay, we're not fertilizing this year because we don't want the grass to grow as much and we're not going to put as much water on, so we can get by with mowing instead of twice a week, we mow once a week to reduce your level of service. But you always have to make that decision. Is that acceptable? Is our community going to accept that? Or do we go, okay, we're mowing, but we're not going to trim edge? Again, saving time, saving personnel costs. But how's that going to look? So, but those are levels of services that as you begin to move into your position as a council person, you begin to ask and start looking, go, well, how often do we do this? How often when we get a pothole, how long do we allow them to be there before we fill them? How long or how much are we going to actually do on a street if we know that it's going to be replaced the next year? And what is the plan? What are our long-term plans? When do these streets get replaced? Are they every 10 years, 5 years, 20 years? You know, what is that? Or is something else going to drive it, such as the sanitation district goes, oh, we're replacing a sewer line along this street, and you really hadn't planned on replacing that for another 5 years, and they're going to do that next year, which means you've got to adjust and start looking at, okay, we're going to not do this street so we can do this one. So those are things that you need to take a look at. What are your services and what are your service levels that are acceptable? And then it all comes back to what are the missions, goals, and objectives set by council, and are they clear and concise, and do they drive the development of the budget so that when departments present the information, are they addressing those levels of services and the service and a timeline that council agrees to and has established and wants to do? Lots to think about. And that's one of the things that council really can do, is just begin to ask a lot of questions. Next slide, please. Council approves the budget established in the city code, and it's an investment in the community and in its quality of life. So there are some things that we go, well, we've got to have fire, we've got to have water, we have to have sanitation pick up. Maybe we don't need Parks and Recreation to be as big as it is. Maybe we don't need to replace all of our roads with asphalt or concrete. You know, maybe it's okay to let some of them be gravel. Or on the other hand, we go, you know, we've got too many gravel roads right now. It costs us more in gravel and more to maintain those than if we went ahead and bit the bullet at this point and paved it. Because in the long term, it may be cheaper for you to do it. So those are different things that you take a look at that may be a little more quality of life rather than an exceptional must-have service. Budgets in the past have been driven by council. We've had some city managers drive those budgets. On occasion, staff members have driven things because they'll have a vision and they get everybody else to buy off on them. But rarely have they really been driven by the community. Now, one of the exceptions you might say is the recreation center. It was originally kind of driven by staff with outside influences from the hospital district, and everybody kind of came together the first time to try and get it going. And it just kept going and going. Even though it didn't pass the first time in like 1990, it came up again in like 2004, and then finally passed when it went through. But it took over 10 years for it to be achieved, and it really took a continuation from members of the community to keep driving it forward. Council owns the budget based on community needs, what they see the vision of the community to be, how the city manager, operations and infrastructure, and departmental programs and infrastructure. Those are all things that you keep in mind when you're taking a look at the budget. Some of the things that work best is really for council to have visioning, to look down the road, take a look at the existing master plans or comprehensive plan. What do those specify? Because those have all gone out to open community meetings and they're renewed every 2, 3, 5 years. They're reviewed because things change. And just because you've set a plan doesn't mean that it's not going to change, because the community can change. Or like I had mentioned earlier, sanitation district says, oh, we're going to put a new sewer line through the street, and you hadn't planned on doing that street for asphalting or concreting at that time. So you have to change your plan. So everything is in flux. Your budgeting, though, needs to be based on clear-cut goals and objectives, clear timelines, identified short-term goals and objectives, and long-term goals and objectives, because sometimes they're going to take and be done in phases. You can't do everything in 1 year. But it comes back to what's the clear vision of where the city is headed. And you have to take a look at what are the annual and projected revenues. Are our revenues equal to our expenses, or are we spending more than we're receiving? Does council want to mandate that it's going to be a balanced budget? Or are you willing, because you have a special project that the entire council buys off on, and you're willing to spend down, say, some of your additional monies to get something accomplished because you have an opportunity? Or do you not want to do something in order to wait a year because there's an opportunity to get additional grant funds? Or you get someone else that's willing to come on board with you. So it's all based upon where are you going, thinking about making that happen, and being clear to your staff of where you're trying to take the city. What are you trying to accomplish? And that comes back again, like I said, having some visioning, taking a look at the existing plans, master plans, comprehensive plans, whatever they may be, and go, do these realistically represent what's going on in the community and where we're trying to take this community or move this community, or what we can do now because things change, COVID-19. You know, what has that effect been? Is that pushing things back? Is it going to slow things down? Whatever it may be. Next slide, please.
I think before we move on, I just want to give an opportunity to anybody to ask a question.
Okay. Yes. Any questions so far? Okay. Right now, the budget that's being proposed by, or that will be proposed, is more or less a continuation budget rather than a brand new budget. Because the things that have happened essentially are, one, you're a new council, you have not had an opportunity to meet and have a visioning session, to do a retreat, take a look at the goals and objectives as set by the previous council, and determine whether or not those have changed or need to be changed, or whether they meet the ongoing or needs or vision of what the community is really needing to do at the present time. Or things have just changed. Have the dollars changed? Revenues changed? Have the expenses gone up so much that you're having to reevaluate how far those dollars are going to go? In addition, some of the things that the budget is based off of are council's projection, and I believe they met in 2017 when they had their planning advanced. So that was 3 years ago. What has changed in 3 years? But that's the information that your staff and city manager are working off of right now. And that's what you're going to see. Probably 90 to 95% of the budget is probably set as a given based on those visions and those goals as set then. So there's probably very little flux available for you to come in and add new things to, if any. I don't know exactly what that is. I know staff had a meeting today trying to get the budget to balance. I'm not sure exactly where that ended up, but at this point in time, I think for this first go round for new council, things are pretty well set because they're based off of the previous council's goals and objectives and visions. So I encourage you at some point in time to have your own retreat and decide and determine whether where the city's going is still correct or not. But that's something that you'll need to do.
If I may say it just a quickly different way is, as Chris said earlier, is the services and the services provided and the level of service that's being provided. That in essence is what the budget is based off of, but those services that have been prioritized as a minimum. Of course, you have some flexibility in how much those services are provided or is given to those services, or what the investment is into that service. But you have to understand, if you take reduce some of that investment, your service level will go down. Or you can add money to service, knowing your service level will go up, or you add a new service altogether. So I just wanted to provide that little clarity, maybe another way of thinking about it, about the services provided and the level of service that we are providing. You do have flexibility to adjust.
Yes, it provides an opportunity in a continuation budget. There's always the opportunity for evaluating city services, programs, and projects and determine if city government is investing in the community in the right places. So even though it's being presented to you, you still have the opportunity to say, I see where we're spending X number of dollars on whatever it may be. Why is that so high? You need to be asking those questions. You have the opportunity to ask those questions. And it may be that, we've gone into partnership with X, Y, and Z, who's contributing X number of dollars. And so this is a community project that numerous partners are participating in. And so that's why we need to continue with it, because there's so many people interested in partnering with us. On the other hand, it could be that you look at it and go, let's phase this. It may be a project that you look at and go, we could pave these 2 streets this year, and let's pave these other 2 streets the next year, rather than doing all 4 this year. That would be out of the street fund. Out of the general fund, it could be something where you look and go, we're not going to spend dollars on developing this park at South Park, say, at this point in time, because we just don't feel we have the wherewithal to back up and come up with the matching dollars. We need to say it's going to take us another 2 or 3 years. Or it could be, it could be in any numerous types of things. But even though it's a continuation budget and much of it is already preset, and is trying to say essentially that the current budget is sufficient for priorities that were established and that they're remaining stable kind of from year to year, that we're continuing with those. That does not mean, like I said, does not mean that you can't ask a question and go, what? Presumes that the current resource allocation is sufficient to match and efficient enough to match the goals and objectives as set by previous council. Next slide.
Can I ask a question before we move on?
Certainly.
Okay, I've got two questions. So one, you said we're basically working on the vision of the previous council then. Are we gonna get a chance then to have a retreat and get together and talk about our ideas for the future, or is that something that's being put off till next year? And the second question is then, are we also looking at basically no capital projects for a year?
Well, I'll turn some of this over to John, but essentially council says that we're going to have a retreat, and then usually they tell the city manager that we want to have a retreat so that we can visit on X, Y, and Z, which may be our visions for where this council is going, where the community stands, et cetera. And then John tries to coordinate it all for you to be able to do that. The first year is really difficult because by the time you come on and the information that you're still gaining and not knowing everything that preceded it, to try to have you meet and set new goals and guidelines in order to be completed before the budget is due makes it real difficult that very first year when you get a new council on. But I encourage you for council to visit and say, hey, yes, we want to have a retreat, and then get with John and see when you can set that up and be thinking towards next year and making those changes. As far as capital, that type of thing, I'll leave that up to John.
Yes, we are going to have retreats. We need to set a second meeting tonight before we all get off of here. I could not everybody responded and not everybody was agreeing on dates. But the good news is that taping, then it's coming through on my video, but it is being recorded, and any council member who misses it can go back and pick it up and then come back and ask us questions. As far as this council giving direction on the budget, we need to do that sooner rather than later. Because right now, as weeks ago, you have a base budget, come in with 2021 budget. That's today because what they came in with, we are projecting a $1.2 million deficit. And so we met today, little about maybe around a $200,000 deficit. But these are not, as Chris said, these are not this council's directions. These are just carryover from last year, and since we don't have audits and we don't know what fund balances are, and we're projecting a deficit, or not a deficit, a recession more or less because of the COVID thing, and because we depend on tourism from Europe and things. We're not going to get that. We may not get it next year, so we are projecting revenues are going to be down. So that's something else the council will be talking about. Of anything right now, you can divert money from one thing and put it somewhere else, but that's going to affect, as Chris said.
Right. So what I'm hearing, just want to make sure I heard this correctly. So even if we did a retreat and did our visioning for the city, it wouldn't. We really wouldn't be able to do much anyway, because we can't really get grants, and then there's this prediction for recession. So even if we were to do any sort of visioning, that visioning would probably change anyway in the next year.
Mm-hmm.
Potentially, yes.
Okay, just want to make sure I heard that correctly. Thank you.
However, the staff still we would all be better off if we had vision from the council on where we want to go. And as Chris said, term and longer term, so we can make, and I'm Ben and I have been staff to do longer term planning, because right now we don't do that very well, and we need to plan for the future and going out a year further than past budgets have. But every time you add staff or add a new road, it costs money in the long run, and you need to know what's going to be working out, what's going to happen in the future when you do these things.
And I think
As,
Mike,
as John is saying, and one of the things that I did not mention is that years ago when we did budgets, we used to do a 5-year capital outlay budget and a 10-year. And somewhere along the lines before John got here, and when I moved over just to doing grants and not doing Parks and Rec, that went away. From which city manager or council, I don't know. But everything essentially just went to a very short-term capital outlay look compared to looking down the road 5 years and 10 years. And in some cases, I know when we were doing the Parks and Recreation Master Plan, we were looking 20 years down the road to say, okay, we've built these shelters and they have a 20-year lifespan or a 15-year lifespan, or the same thing with a playground. So we knew that in 15 years, we needed to replace that playground, and you would have a new expense coming up. So you'd put that into your plan. But like it said, someplace over the last 3 to 5 years before John got here, that kind of went away. And now John and Ben are trying to get back to that, where departments and council and staff are looking further down the road.
and Arlena, the way you say it, it sounds a little defeatist, right? And I know that's not your intent or what you mean. And I think it's still good for you all to go through that process. Okay. Another opportunity through that, which is good for us as staff and for John as city manager to direct the staff, is going back to those services and the service levels, right? We have a challenge that John's talking about, a deficit that we're looking at having to manage, right? Council still getting together and meeting and having your vision can help define what services are important and what service levels are important. So if we have to go back and say we need to cut X number of investment dollars into those services, it helps us guide us to stay away from those key services, so to speak, right? So it's that direction. So it's very pertinent. And I would even say at this time, it's more important, okay? When you have the surpluses and the funds, that's when it gets really exciting though. That's why everybody wants to, okay, what can we go invest in now, right? Because then you feel like you're taking big steps for the community in your vision, right? But part of as we talked about, was your function is providing oversight, the financial oversight and of the city and how it's administered, right? So it's not a small task during challenging times where you don't know what your fund balance is, your revenues are being hit, you have a deficit, to make us come out on the other side stronger and better.
This is Green. There's a couple things that also figure every council gets, I'll call them some legacy that are items that take more than one council to accomplish, and they're about basic needs. I've always referred to them as fire, life, safety, or maybe in your instances, water and fiber. And some things that, you need some information from staff on whether or not those things are possible or doable, and when or how, and see how they influence your hopes, your dreams for the city. Some of these things are very infrastructure related. You can't have a city without them. So there's some big ticket items that may also detract from, like I say, the hopes, the dreams, the wish.
I'd like to add that I recognize the need for a get-together retreat, and we'll definitely schedule some time, because this council has never actually physically gotten together And we need to find out how each one of us have a vision for the future. And so I'm very flexible time-wise. So I just like to add, that whenever the council wants to get together, I'm amenable to whenever and wherever you want to meet. I just want to add that. And I think it's very important that we discuss our visions for the future, because it's a time of uncertainty, and we need to see how each other are thinking about things for the future.
I think one of the things I'll add before I explain a little bit more is that these are very challenging times, and your new council is going to be doing things that previous councils have never had to experience. And one of them already is, holding Zoom council meetings, having to meet for trainings like this instead of in person. Who knows how long this is going to continue, what the outcome's going to be. So I encourage you to continue to think about moving forward, how to get together, how to vision, how to develop what it is that you're wanting to do. At the same time, I encourage you to think, in order to go fast, you have to go slow. Because if you don't plan things out, you end up making steps and taking steps that don't move you in the direction that you really want to go down the road, because you haven't thought far enough ahead yet. So doing these trainings, getting as much information as you can, asking questions, I think will behoove you, especially over this next year, till you can really get a chance to sit down and vision, take a look at where you're headed. Yes, you're all ready to go, move forward. Let's take some steps. You want to get involved, but move slow to go fast. So anyway, that's just a comment. If there's no other questions, next item on the agenda is item 2.
I got a question.
Orly has a question.
Oh, Orly, go ahead.
Yeah, those are good questions asked there, gals. And but the question I have, every time I hear that our sales tax is going good and everything, and are we even going to have a balanced budget by the end of the year? There's one. Then the second one is, if you like they asked before, the vision or whatever for the for the new council that's here, are we going to have the balanced budget to do what we need to do? What I'm confused on that part is, we're saying the sales tax and everything's good going on, but we still have to cut the budget a bunch. It's because of tourism or sales tax?
The sales tax is coming in better than anticipated, but is still down from last year. The hotel tax is down dramatically. That's just off the charts down. Sales tax, we were projecting, I believe, a percent decrease.
1.1 million.
Go ahead.
I was just saying 1.1 million was the initial expectation decrease.
And now we're anticipating it somewhere around 200,000. It was May's sales tax number came in a lot better than we had anticipated. But there again, 1 month does not make up the whole year. We need to take things very slowly on putting things back in. To answer your question, will be whether this year's will be or not by the time we get to the end of the year, hopefully.
I just add to that just real quick that I think there are a lot of things that are unknown as far as our government is concerned on a local level, because we're seeing, in some of the states, the rise in COVID cases. Some of the aspects that the federal government instituted have run out. the dollars that they had set aside for unemployment are beginning to run out, so they may have to renew that. I think there's just so much unknown still at this point in time. I think it's anybody's best guess as to where it's going to go later in the year. I've been encouraged that it has been a surprise, I think, to nearly everyone that the city of Cortez's sales tax are much higher than were anticipated. Not normal, but higher than expected, compared to some other cities that are having to cut hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars because their sales tax are not keeping pace. So I just think who knows where it's going.
Chris, I have a question. There seems to be no precedent. It's sort of like dancing in the dark. So is it possible to draw some information from, let's say, the former recession or some past experience that would come close to what we're experiencing now?
I'll take that one if you want, John.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
First off, dancing in the dark sounds so much more fun. Unless it's a China shop, I guess, or a dungeon. Joking aside, so the initial analysis that I provided, I think, was back in April, and I think it actually went to the prior council. It was the meeting just before you all, I think it was the evening you all got inducted. I provided the initial analysis, and it went in great detail on the forecasting of how we got to $1.1 million of a potential decline in sales taxes. And a lot of that analysis was based upon going back all the way to 2004 on seeing the tax collections rise and then fall through the Great Recession. The Great Recession, sales taxes decreased by about, for over a 3-year period, from between 5 and 10%, depending on the period and time, okay? So yeah, we drew a lot upon that. I will stress, though, we are in unprecedented times. The Great Recession was a financial recession. We are now in a health pandemic that is creating a financial recession. So it's a different take on what's causing the financial recession, right? So the financial recession is self-induced. We did it to ourselves, right? So how people are reacting and responding is much different. And that may be why we're coming in much stronger than the 1.1 million decrease that we were looking at initially, why we're coming in higher, better revenues and not the biggest declines as we expected, because our community and area is just different enough versus if you go look at Eagle County, right? Or Vail, where they're getting hit huge because of sales tax, because of dramatic, they're more tourism based, you could almost say, or the influx of the Front Range folks driving up for the daily, I don't know, après ski or whatever they're doing, right? You know, so there's that. And then very volatile, right? Because not only are we in COVID-19 financial impacting, there's geopolitical and national political things going on, which all impact.
What happened?
His screen froze. Ben, your screen has frozen.
Okay, I'm still here. Okay, thanks. To best of our ability, information to you all so you can make decisions that you need to make, right? And you have information you need. That's partly why every month I'm providing you with two things. One is I'm providing you with an update to the COVID impact, right? I'm showing you, here's the actual sales tax taken in the month. Here's what was budgeted. Here's your difference. And we're updating it every month. It's very important, right? And that's where we're seeing now is like, you know what? We're not doing as bad as we had predicted. You know, that's a good thing. And we're being very transparent on how we're predicting or projecting the future out. Because if you all, let's say, disagree that we're being too conservative, we can adjust accordingly, right? So that's one thing I'm providing. The second thing providing then is the monthly financial report. Right now, since we missed last meeting, in the next meeting, I think you'll see it, is for June, is you'll have the general fund, the street improvement fund, the rec center fund, and the equipment fund. You have the revenues and expenditures for each of those compared to budget year over year, and various other information. In fact, it's probably too much. Probably will drive you nuts looking at it, make you go cross-eyed. But we're providing that to you so you have those tools to guide us, guide the city, guide the direction, and make decisions. You know, so coming orally, your question is very valid. How do we know we're still going to be in the deficit at the year end? Well, we don't. We can only forecast out based off of what we know and what we think our future assumptions are on the revenue or the expenses. And that's why we're being very, transparent in showing you what we think the revenues are going to come in at, so we can then say this is how it's impacting the budget. And then from a budgeting perspective, we have, and we're doing a this year revised budget, where it will revise the 2020 budget from what was initially approved, which will take into mind the decrease in revenues and then any changes in expenses. And you can compare and we can adjust accordingly.
So we're going to be focusing on short-term goals as opposed to long-term in the near future. Would that be safe to say?
This is probably more of a question for John, and to that guidance, and I'd say to the rest of your council members. My thoughts is what we are doing to provide for a budget perspective is we're providing a revised budget for 2020. We'll be providing the 2021 budget, and new this year, we're going to be providing a 2022 budget. And the 2022 budget is to give you an idea based off of trends and the investments through our expenses and services, and then the revenues coming in, to give you an idea. What I've heard John and your fellow council members is it's all of it, short, medium, long, right? It's that strategic view. John, I'll let you add.
I would add, except he broke up so bad during the thing. All I picked up was when you started talking. So
just nod your head and say yes.
Okay.
It sounded like someone else was trying to make a comment.
I have a question, Ben. Do you have any idea what's driving this increase in sales tax income? Is there a certain sector of the community? Is it groceries, supplies, marijuana?
What I'm calling it is WAG. I forgot, what was the A? Oh yeah, weed, alcohol, and groceries. So WAG, that's what I was calling it. And that's kind of what's leading it. Unfortunately, the restaurant industry is hit. I think they've stabilized a bit from what I could tell last month. They're down, but not down to the levels that scared everybody when this first hit, okay? I think what happened for the restaurants, though, is what people were spending on restaurants went to groceries, okay? One other thing that I've been hearing other communities are seeing, and we're seeing it too, but it's not part of WAG, is I would say is home or property investment, upgrades, updates, home improvement, okay? Because we have some of those. We don't have necessarily the big box stores here, right? Like Home Depot, Lowe's, but we have a couple others. And from what I can tell is their numbers are coming in strong, and if not higher than what they have been in previous years. So it's making up for the decrease that we see in tourism, and it's making up for the decrease that you might see in some of the other service industry, like restaurant, or some of those other industries where you have a lot of face-to-face contact. So it's making up for a lot of that. Not quite to the level to make up for it, but it's pretty strong. I think June might surprise us. Actually, it might actually come in even. We'll see. I need to run those numbers again, but they surprised me dramatically when I looked last week.
Thank you, Ben.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're moving on to the second item under work session. Duncan is going to tell you some stories and provide some backdrop for why you need financial management and why best practices. He's also going to introduce you to some standard terms, differences in private sector versus public sector, talk about core elements, roles, and responsibilities of city council and city manager and staff, how that fits in, why council needs to set some communication protocols, along with identifying what a budget is, who owns it, what are the funds, and different ways of preparing budgets. So with that, I'll turn it over to Duncan.
Thank you, Chris, and good evening to everybody, and particularly congratulations to the 4 new members on the council. Strap on your seatbelt. It's going to be an adventure, I can assure you. It's very much a privilege and a pleasure to talk again. And as we did last year, we have changed, made a few changes, and concentrated a little bit on some other areas. I'd like to start out with a story about setting the context for the discussion tonight. Ben, next slide.
Yep.
I'm going to kill this part right up here. Bear with me. Yeah. So basically, the fundamental question that we're looking at is, what is the essence of world-class city management? How can the city of Cortez, small as it is, actually achieve and attain a world-class status in city management because it understands and is adhering to what's considered best practice in the financial management world? I was privileged to, as Chris mentioned, to spend time in the city manager's office in Dallas. This was back in the 70s. There was a tradition where the city manager would ride to the airport with younger folks, and it would be about 45 minutes in the car of mentoring time. So thank you, Ben. So we would ride, and you would actually get some time to talk with one of the most eminent city managers in the country. At that time, Dallas, Phoenix, San Diego, and Miami were some of the finest run cities in the world. So this was a wonderful opportunity to get some insight. And interestingly, the day that Sue had called over the executive assistant and asked if I'd be able to take him to the airport, the city manager was coming out of an all-day session with leaders from all over the country who were basically identifying this question: what is the essence of world-class city management? And the bottom line that basically the city manager said was, the city is only as strong as its financial management practices. This is what came out of the all-day workshop with the city council and these world leaders and experts in city management. A city is only as strong as its financial management practices. So let's drill in on this. Let's focus a little bit about what does this world-class mean in terms of practices. Next slide. Basically, a community is an incredibly complex set of dynamics. And the task, as you're starting to learn, the new council people and certainly the experienced pros that are sitting at your side, it's not easy to understand what are the needs, exactly as Chris and Ben and John have been going over. What are the needs? What are the challenges? What is the vision? And how do we draw the correct resources to make this work? So what services? How much? Why are these particular services being the ones that we basically take limited resources? And we're going to underscore that word. And already you're into that tonight. It's about limited resources spread basically against unlimited needs. So how do you make the decision where you cut off the line? Not only who gets it, but how much of the total pie is extracted from the community to pay for community resource or to programs and stuff. Basically, yes, thank you. The challenge is basic management function. Every manager, whether it's private or public, has the challenge of having a plan, of successfully executing programs to try to achieve that plan, and then controlling and monitoring. This is a classic standard, a paradigm of traditional management. What is then the glue that pulls all of this together, that makes it work? Next slide. Thank you. It's financial management. Financial management links the vision, the execution, and the control. And think about that, because you are the folks who set the vision. The city manager and staff through the city manager execute and control. So basically, what we have then is a simple statement that Cortez's management engine, the whole engine of how the city is run and structured, is actually embedded in, and it's accomplished through its budget. So you're not just generating as a council a set of numbers. You're developing a management plan that causes things to happen, okay? You are causing things to happen. And your mediator, your executor, is the city manager. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. Next slide, please. How then does a city hall differ from, say, a Sears or a Walmart or any other private sector corporation out there, or the proprietorship? Let's start and take a look at some attributes and go through a simple discussion. And put yourself in the chair wearing the hat of the private sector, and then turn that hat around and then put it on for the city hall. What is the economic focus of the private sector? Well, it's, in technical terms, it's called selling private goods. What is a private good? Private good is something that satisfies my particular want, and it is excludable. The consumption of that particular service or good is something that I buy, that's once I buy it, somebody else can't buy that particular good because I have consumed it. That benefit is private to me or to my family or to whatever. Contrast that with what a city is about. It's about public goods. What you are basically selling and delivering are things that serve the community, for which the marketplace does not particularly work well. For example, such things as streets, or water systems, or fire service, or police service, things that simply are built a little bit better and sold a little bit better to the community as a community public good. Let's talk then about the arena in which these types of things happen.
Duncan, I have a question.
I'm sorry, yes, Mike.
Under the public good section, under City Hall, it says free riders. Could you explain that term?
Sure, exactly. That's a very good point. And I think your best example is perhaps why fire service is considered a public good. If my neighbor buys fire service and there's a major fire, I don't have to pay for fire service if they come to put out the fire at his house, because it's not going to come to my house. Or the same thing perhaps with defense. It's a classic example of that. If one person has to buy an army to protect their particular area, by the army protecting that area, I can get a free ride and don't have to pay for the service as a private market kind of situation. So that's why, or a road. If my neighbor builds a road into town, I can get on the road and use the road as a free rider and not pay for it. So in those kinds of situations, it's better then to consider coming together as a community and sharing the cost rather than each of us building a separate road into town. You see what I'm saying? That's the kind of discussion.
Thank you, Duncan.
You bet. Externalities, very simply, are such things that are impacts that are not included in the actual cost of the product. The most classic example is air pollution. Somebody can build a product, but it's not, can build a product, they can pollute the air, think of Pittsburgh and the steel plants in the old days. Nobody is paying for correcting that smog in the air, or that the pollution in the air, in the price of the good. I can go to the market and buy a piece of steel, but that price does not include the impact on my neighbors or anybody else, me and myself, of what's in the air. That's called an externality. It's a cost external to the actual cost of the price of the good that you're buying. And then, of course, equity then is if I am going to make this as a community good, how do we share the cost fairly? Who pays how much? Whether it's on the property sale of the property value, rather, or whether it's on the cost of the good as a sales tax. There are equity issues, of fairness issues, of how much each person should pay as a community good. Whereas in the market, what you should pay for that is determined by supply and demand, of course. Does that make sense, Mike?
Yep, thank you, sir.
You bet. So the arena is the marketplace, we said. The other then is the commons. And if you look at history in England, for example, there was literally a place called the commons, which was where the community came together and shared that particular area as the commons, as separate from their fields, et cetera. And they could come together and they could have their festivals and they could have their town meetings, et cetera, et cetera. So again, City Hall is the commons. It's where the community can come without having to go through a market price to go into a theater or whatever. What then is the private sector about? It's about sales and it's about expenses. In your case, in city, it's about taxes, fees, and grants. It's the way you raise your revenue. Taxes are a very interesting, in fiscal policy theory, taxes are a very interesting concept because it is an exaction. It is the police power that you have, the public police power that you have to force somebody to come out of their pocket to pay for those common goods. That's quite different from the market. You vote in the market, as we all know, by going into this store and buying this good versus going into that store and buying this good. But you as city council have an authority delegated to you through your charter to exact money, and if somebody doesn't pay, you have the capacity to penalize them. And the term that we use in the equivalent of expenses, the term that you'll hear used in public sector management is disbursements, the money that you disperse out. The bottom line, your bottom line is quite different from what a corporation or a store or whatever would have. The bottom line in the private sector, as we all know, is profit and loss, paying dividends, and reinvesting. And of course, this is what builds our very powerful economy. You, on the other hand, have a similar concept of profit and loss, but it's actually called surplus and deficit. And that's exactly what Chris and John and Ben were just talking about. The revenues you raise through taxes, fees, and grants is put into the budget. And then on the disbursement side, what flows out by the end of that budget year, you may have a deficit or you may have a surplus. Now, technically, you won't have a deficit because you can't by law. So you have to then either go and borrow some money or you reduce your expenses by laying people off or whatever, so that you end the year without a deficit. But as we'll see in just a moment, the financial reports are oriented towards surplus and deficit, not profit and loss. You are not, as a city hall, about making a profit. You are about breaking even in terms of what you dispersed to generate services and only raised enough revenue to comfortably cover that, responsibly cover that disbursement. And the other thing too is, instead of building private wealth, you're building community wealth. Every time you add a street, every time you add a recreation center, you're adding wealth. The value of the community is increasing. So you are investors. You are investing in the community on behalf of the community by exacting taxes and paying for a rec center. And so you have to be comfortable in your own minds that that is, in fact, a worthy investment that you can just justify in your own minds.
Duncan's.
Yes.
So,
Hey, Rachel.
so where does like savings come in play? You know, because you said the amount coming in should be the amount going out, but you know, like reserves or rainy day funds, like how does that play in?
Bingo. Right on. Dead on. Anytime you have a surplus, we call that a positive fund balance, okay? And we're going to talk about funds and what they are and why they're there a little bit later. But if you have some surplus money toward the end of the year, you can do one of two things with it. One is you can return it in the form of a tax reduction the next year, or you can put it into a reserve account, exactly as you're saying, and what we call a carry forward beginning balance. And it basically can reduce what you would have basically raised in taxes because you move that surplus into the following year and use it as a starting point. It's a bank balance, you see what I'm saying? And it then gives you a starting point that's ahead of zero as you move forward. Now, we would suggest, best practice says you always want to have an operating reserve. So it may be that in terms when you're facing basically a shortfall, and you may even have to go into short-term debt to go to the bank and get a 60-day loan or something like that, then you want to then build a reserve so you avoid that. So that when you do have hard times, you have that money there to back you up. And there's a basic rule of thumb about how big that reserve should be, 2%, 3%, sometimes even up to 5%, depending exactly on what Ben and Chris and John were just talking about. These are uncertain times. So you may want to hold off adding any new programs or any new expenditures that aren't here, build up that reserve until we get through this period of time of uncertainty and the risk is reduced. But that's a very good question, Rachel.
And our code says we have to have 20% of budget expenses in reserve.
Cool. That's a minimum, right?
A minimum.
Right. So in times of great uncertainty, it might be feasible to even move it a bit larger. Which leads to the next point. I'll go over here at primary operational monitoring tools. What in the world do I mean by that? This is the basic fundamental set of tools that you, the council, and the city manager and staff are looking at to manage the day-to-day operations, the month-to-month operations of the organization. In the private sector, pretty much those of you that have worked there, it's profit and loss statement, it's the balance sheet, and it's the cash flow. It's what we call the financial statements, okay? That's what people look at. That's what we look at in the private sector, profit and loss. Sometimes we're running P&L statements once a week when we're in really challenging times kind of thing. That is an important set of documents called financial statements. It's important to City Hall, but it is not what you manage against. What you manage against is the budget, okay? And that's very, very different. The budget is used in the private sector, but it is not the prime monitoring device that managers use. What's the difference? In the public sector, you are filling a bucket called a fund. At the beginning of the year, you start with a new bucket full of monies that is allocated to the fire department, that is allocated to the police department, that is allocated to the water department. And you tell that manager that he or she is to deliver a certain prescribed certain level of service and type of service within that bucket right there. So that basically the bucket is filled at the beginning of the year. It's called an appropriation. And that appropriation is a legal step. When you adopt the budget, it becomes a legal document. And we'll talk more about this as we go forward. But you fill the bucket as the city council once you adopt the budget. And that budget is structured to instruct you as to how much each organizational unit has in their bucket. And then for that bucket, in exchange for that bucket, the amount of bucket, they are going to deliver you a certain amount of service, whether it's the library, whether it's the Parks and Recreation Department, whatever it is. Quite different, isn't it, from running a business where I'm looking at daily at sales and then the cost of sales. That's important, but it's not how you will manage in the public sector. Now, what's the bottom line? The bottom line is fund balance. It's a term you have to get comfortable with because this is your fiduciary responsibility as a city council person. That fund balance needs to stay positive. If it goes negative, the fund balance is simply the amount that's left in the fund day after day. As you top up the fund at the beginning of the year, you draw it down. And Ben's job is to keep looking in exactly what he talked about earlier. How much revenues are coming into this fund and what is the rate of expenditure? So that if I project to the end of the year, do I have enough revenue coming in and what's still in the bucket that I can get through the end of the year and hopefully break even or have a small surplus as a cushion? Does that make sense? That's your job as a council to watch. Now, Ben's going to be bringing these kinds of reports in, but you're going to be looking at for each fund what the balance is and what it's projected to be by the end of the year. That's the most important thing that you'll be looking at. And your fiduciary role, and we'll talk about roles a little bit later, you're acting on behalf of the citizens that they're in fact not overspending the budget and staying within that budget. And we'll
Right,
talk about adjustments and things as we go forward in just a minute. Is this clear? Am I making sense with this?
I think so for me, Duncan. So Ben, when you give us the financial reports each month and there's I don't remember what it's called, but there's like the item where it shows like what we plan to spend and what's been spent. That's kind of what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, that's a tool that I'm providing you. So like as Duncan said, think about a bucket, right? It's filled this high. And as we go through the year, and let's say this is your total disbursements. You approved $1 million of disbursements, okay? As we go through the year, you start filling that bucket. You fill in that bucket, right? So that's what I'm providing you is with a comparison of how quickly is that bucket filling. So let's say you approve $1 million of disbursements, and by the third month you have half of it spent. Right. So it gives you that tool to give you a way to ask questions, because it may be perfectly legit, right? But it gives you that tool to ask to get what you need.
Yeah.
One thing I'll add is, because it is important, is you say you approve $1 million, right? What happens if I go over? Okay. Here's what, that's illegal unless you provide a new appropriation to make it even.
So you can modify the budget throughout the year, tracking how it is. But when Ben held up his right hand and said, here's what you've said, that's called the appropriation. You have appropriated that. That is a legal amount of dollars that you have authorized the city manager to disperse through his staff to accomplish the mission of that particular set of dollars. Now, exactly as he was saying, if we have two hands, what's happened is you've done a legal appropriation, said this is what's appropriated, you're authorized this amount, but if the revenues only come into here, what do? You can't make revenues out of the air. You can't just bring it up. You've got to bring the appropriation down. So mid-year or toward the end of the year, and you see that we're not going to make the revenues for this legal appropriation. This is an authorization to the fire department. And if we don't have enough money to do that, you come back and you make a budget amendment, and it is a legal obligation. You've changed the appropriation through a modified budget amount to match what the revenue is. On the other hand, if it looks like this is what's coming in, you have two choices. Leave that difference as fund balance, Rachel was talking about. It's fund balance and you can carry it forward, or in the current year, you can raise the appropriation and invest it in something else, additional level of service or additional service. Does that make sense?
A point of clarification, as Duncan was saying, okay, our revenues only come in short based off of our appropriations. That difference, that gap, out of my face, that gap, you could take it from your fund balance to fill that gap if you have sufficient funds and if you're not going against your code of a minimum 20% of disbursements required in your reserve.
Exactly.
You like that? If this, if that?
Now this is the kind of thing that you learn, you hear in 100% level and you learn in 10% steps,
Yeah.
that you absorb it. And
No, I appreciate the visualization, and I do appreciate that tool existing on the financial documents. Thank you.
You bet. Now then, we're down here to what is the secondary level of tools. And we look in the private sector. The private sector does use the budget, but it's not they can change. They don't need to do appropriations. It's not a legal document. It's simply a working document inside. In your case, it requires a formal resolution to actually make then these appropriations and modifications as you go through. So your financial statements are important. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But it's the budget that drives, it's the engine that drives the management plan through the organization. Now, the reporting model. In the private sector, the financial statements generally are developed around the organizational unit. For example, if I've got an office in this city and an office in this city and an office in this city, that's one way to report, or it may be a particular product line over here versus product line over there. In the public sector over here in the green space, it's about fund accounting. That's not fun accounting, it's fund accounting. And believe me, it is not fun accounting. It is a complicated concept. We're going to talk a little bit more about it, and we'll see a slide in a minute. The funds do not follow staff organization. Do not confuse the two. The fund accounting we're going to talk about in just a little bit, but it is a term and a concept that we all have to get our heads around to understand and be effective in financial management, okay? Now then, let's, I'm having trouble here, having to move these images of people around the screen here. Operational analytics. I'm talking here now about the type of accounting that we're talking about. If I really want to understand how things work in the private sector, I want to do cost accounting or what's called managerial accounting. So I have financial accounting and then I have everything else. Financial accounting is required in the financial statements, and there are rules and principles that have to be followed to develop that. Managerial accounting simply asks such questions as, well, how much did this particular program or project over here cost versus this project or this component of the car over here, how much did it cost? That's a different level and a different type of accounting. In the city, we're not so much focused on cost centers and managerial accounting, although that's useful. It's about performance metrics. We can't use the profit and loss. You're not about making a profit. So how do we measure success in the private sector? How much profit did I make? You can't ask how much profit I made in the general fund over here in the city. So basically we look at different types of metrics called performance metrics. How well did this service perform? How well did our management team do? And we're going to talk about some of those metrics in a few minutes. And finally, and I know this is a bit of you feel like you're drinking out of a fire hose, and I apologize for that. But the final concept and the difference that we can look at is the accounting principles. So let's talk a little bit about accounting principles. How many of you heard the word GAAP? G-A-A-P. GAAP is another one of those terms that you need to start putting into your vocabulary. Arlena, that's good. GAAP stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, okay? And these are statements of how financial reports are to be derived. It's nothing to do with budgets. This is about financial reports, which is the profit and loss statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow. Those are the terms we use in the private sector. The equivalent over here is the statement of activities, which is the profit and loss statement, the statement of net assets, which is equivalent to the balance sheet, and the source and use of cash, okay? Now let's don't get too deep into this yet. Let's set this aside as a future type of work session once you're comfortable with the budget. But it is important because there's a lot of story inside those financial reports, okay? And the word is story. Looking in and say, what is the story that these numbers are telling us about how well we're managing our finances? For example, do I have enough, how many months of cash do I have on hand? How many months of operations of cash do I have on hand? Do I have only 2 months of cash that at the end of 2 months, if we don't get more cash in, we're going to be running out of money? Or do I have 6 months? You see where I'm going with this? These are the kinds of things that are in that story. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, Duncan. And if you remember, that was one of the, back in April, I had mentioned we have probably about I think it was a 3.5 month cash flow of cash on hand to cover expenses if we had no revenue coming in at all. And that was intentional to give you an idea of, worst case scenario, so to speak.
So let's do one more concept and then we'll take a deep breath and go to the next slide. The concept, what are the accounting principles? There is a FASB, a Financial Accounting Standards Board. They set the principles, generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, for the private sector, okay? And they're dynamic. They're constantly evolving and refined, and they guide every auditor and every accountant in the private sector as to how those financial reports are to be created and what they mean. The equivalent in the public sector is called GASB, Governmental Accounting Standards Board. And this group is built on, the accounting standards are built on and as close as they can to the FASB over here in the private sector. But where FASB does not work, GASB takes over. Now you will have an independent auditor someday. And that independent auditor, and that's another whole story, but that independent auditor is going to look at your books from this set of rules right here. These accounting principles, GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, as promulgated by GASB. And they're going to come in. Now let's understand something. The numbers in these financial reports over here that we talk about, financial reports, statement of activities, net assets, those are basically required statements. You're required to be generating those. And you generate those, Ben generates those, presents those to the city manager. An audit by an auditor looks over the staff's shoulder. It is you, city council, that owns these financial reports. It is not the auditor. The auditor simply looks at the financial reports and says, yes, they are consistent with GASB, and they fairly present the state of your operations, or it does pretty good job, but there's a few exceptions, or it says you're in deep doo. These are not consistent with generally accepted accounting principles, and they do not tell you what's going on, okay? So the most important takeaway thing here is you will have a financial audit when this all gets sorted out every single year. And that audit is of your records, and your records are kept by your finance department. And it's going to say they are consistent with these GASB principles, GAAP, or they are not, okay? If they are not, it's up to you as the city council to direct changes so that they become consistent. You see where we're going with this? So you have certain roles and responsibilities that are extremely important. When you stepped into this job, you inherited these kinds of responsibilities. Ben?
Yeah, point of clarification is what's expected from an audit. There's, I think, a misperception that audit, when they give you the numbers, is saying that they're 100% accurate. They're 100% complete, okay? That there can be nothing wrong, no fraud, no misappropriation, whatever. Nope, that's not the case. You can have what they call a clean audit opinion. That means you were in accordance with the GAAP, okay? But you can still have fraud occur, okay? It's not 100%. It is a reasonable expectation that, yes, in most cases, if anybody was looking at that financial statement, that it wouldn't change their mind on how they would understand the financial numbers, right? So you can have fraud. If it was a little bitty fraud, they can't guarantee it. If you had a huge fraud, you know, hopefully they would have found it. But because of their approach, it's a sample-based approach, they may not find it. So that's one thing. The other is there's a misperception, I believe, that auditors are also ensuring that we are adhering to our code, okay? To our you know, so if our code says you have to do X, Y, Z with your money, they're not necessarily looking at that. What they may say is, okay, you moved money from this fund to this fund. Did you do it in a GAAP principle, in a GAAP manner? But they're not going to, you know, and then but they're not going to go through all of your code and make sure that that actually happened. So I wanted to add that clarity.
So what's the takeaway from this particular slide? This particular slide says it's good to run City Hall similar to a business. You should not run it as a business. It is not a business. It is about public goods, and it is about common community services. And because of that, we have different accounting rules and we have different reporting rules, okay? So when you walk in to City Hall, you take off your hat as the private sector and you put on your City Hall hat and you see things from the public perspective and the public good. The two most important sets of reports, the budget first, and then the financial reports second. Okay, so you need to familiarize yourself, you need to put them in your hands and look at them and start understanding, and it will take time. It will take time. It will take several years before you really understand and can take it apart. But you're not going to start until you start asking questions. That's back to what Chris was saying. Ask the questions. I don't understand where you're coming from here. Ask the question and expect an answer, okay? I'm off my soapbox. Let's move to the next slide.
And the subject of audits, before we go on further, and I know it's on almost everyone's mind, we're way behind in our audit, and we're just kind of wondering, you know, how long will it take to catch up, and when do we start this year's auditing? And I know you're going to address this eventually, but you know, I just want to clear the air, because you know, a lot of us are wondering how the audits are proceeding and what it's going to be like in the future.
John, would you like to take that, or would you like me to?
Excuse me, the goal is to have 2016 and 2017 done this year, 2018, 2019, and 2020 would be done next year. We have run into some bottlenecks, I guess. Lorraine has stretched herself a little too thin right now. That will all drop off, and she would be able to pick up a lot more time with us. The other problem is our auditors. I believe he went from 5 people in his office to just 2. And so the business he has is getting backed up also. The only good thing about that is he's already done most of 2016's work. He just relook at things, replug numbers, and then it's good to go. So I think that's essentially it. The rest of it I will talk about in executive session in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Is that, I know there's a lot of questions there, so is there more? Clear the
I
air.
guess,
That-
I guess, this is Arlena. I guess my question would be, I know that, so there's this bottlenecking, right? So what can we do to help alleviate some of that bottlenecking to get things going again to more full capacity?
Yeah, and I'll take that one, John, if you're okay. So initially the intent was we didn't really get the go-ahead from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation to restart cleaning up our numbers until about February. And then I think it was in about March where council gave us the approval to go ahead and bring on Lorraine as a third party to help us clean things up, okay? And because we were kind of, on her, if you look at it from her view, she doesn't know if she's going to have us as a business or not, or when it's going to start, right? So from her business standpoint, she had to fill her sales queue up, right, on business that she needs to do to keep her, so she can eat, pay her bills, right? And so that's part of where we get that bottleneck with her, right? We had her, the intent initially was to have her do majority of the work, right? And that was intentional. Part of that was to provide you all as council members with comfort that, not just you, but the community with comfort that our situation, the numbers were going to be done in a proper manner and accounted for properly and transacted properly through Cassell. That was the initial intent, right? So I gave Lorraine some time to get through that. And then I discovered, okay, she's not moving as quickly as I expected. Because initially, at one point I had a roadmap of everything that we want to do as finance and whatnot. And I realize now my eyes were bigger than my stomach. But on that roadmap, the thought was we'd have everything done by fall this year. Okay. So just being very transparent there. That was what I thought we could do at that time when he developed that, when I did that last November. Okay. So seeing that Lorraine was a little behind, not moving as quickly, I actually got really involved at that point. I started a lot of the analysis and data work that needed to be done, I ended up having to do. And then I would have to wait for Lorraine to get involved because Cassell is new to me. I don't know Cassell. And so I'd get Lorraine on to help me walk through to make sure we got those transactions properly cleaned up and accounted for in our financial system. Okay. So for example, one of the first things we had to do was our bank reconciliation. Okay. And that probably, until I really got involved, was about a month. Part of that was because when Lorraine got in there, she had an excuse my language for a moment, she had an oh shit moment. This is terrible. And so I was like, okay. So then we had to figure out how to reapproach the situation. And then I said, okay, now let me help, let me take over or get moving. So we got moving. And so now we're moving piece by piece. It's still not as quickly as we want, but it's the resources we have available to us. Basically myself and Lorraine, okay? Other staff, so the staff that I have, so Sarah and Lynette, if you haven't met them, please make sure you say hi at some point. They are, I've had them trying to clean up future years as well. So when we get to those years, we can move hopefully quicker, okay? Doesn't mean it won't take longer at those points, but hopefully quicker than what it was. So today we're moving step by step. I think at 16, we made some good progress over the weekend. Got to do some analysis, get back with Tim. So each of these steps, it's like a handoff. Okay, I got the baton, let me hand it to you. Okay, you got the baton, give it back. Each one of those takes time, and sometimes depending on who it's handed to, that's where that bottleneck comes in. So that's where I'm trying to come in and just almost like brute force it through.
Okay. And I just want to make sure I'm hearing this correctly. So it sounds like Lorraine, like you said, she had to take on other work. Is she, like, do we have to keep her specifically on with this project? Or is there somebody we can hire on that would be able to dedicate more time?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely a fair question. So what was it? It was March last year when we realized we had some cleanup that needed to happen. And we actually brought Cassell in twice. We did them in March, April, and then the second time was in June. And let's just put it this way, it did not go well. And what I found is in the work that Lorraine and I've done, we've had to clean up some of their mess, okay? So then we said, we knew we needed to move quickly or try to move quickly. That was before CBI investigation and all that. And I was talking to our auditor and I said, hey, do you know someone who knows accounting, but more importantly also knows Cassell? Because that was the challenge, is somebody with both skill sets. Cassell knew Cassell, but they didn't take the time to understand the accounting or our situation for certain transactions. So they just, I don't know, they made noise, we'll put it that way, okay? And that's how we found Lorraine, right? So it's the skill set that we're very specific on and looking for, which is why we brought her in. There's not a lot of people who have both of that, Cassell and the accounting. And I forget when we took Lorraine forward to council, but we provided her, to council, we provided her resume, list of clients, and why she believes she's the right person for the job.
Okay.
I know you want to
yeah.
move faster.
I know. I'm just trying to think of ways as a council that we can help move things along. And it's a bummer to hear that there's these bottlenecks. And I know that you guys are all working really hard on getting this done. And we're going to be annoying and keep asking every time you go on how things are going and what's the new timeline.
And
we've been doing that all year.
Yeah.
And frankly, you should be, okay? As much as I don't, it's gonna be to my detriment, right? Because I'm gonna have to hear it every time. But you should be. Hold me accountable. Hold John accountable. Hold, that we're moving forward. And if so, for some reason, let's say, right now, John, we're saying 2016, 17 should be done by the end of the year. If they're not, you should be asking, why not? What happened? What's going on? Right? And at some point, you should get an answer, a response from us.
Right. Sorry. Go ahead. I guess one other question I had is, was there anybody else that came up with those skill sets that was brought to council?
I heard about one other individual who's up in Grand Junction, but the accounting skill set wasn't quite to the level that wanted. They're more of a Cassell, they're an ex-Cassell employee, which is no knock against them because Cassell's a good company. But there's more of the background from the Cassell side rather than the accounting. And I didn't want to get into the same challenges that we had when we brought Cassell on originally. And so I'll tell you, when Lorraine has the time, and she's moving a little quicker now, okay, there's still gaps, but when she sits down and focuses on us, she gets it done very quickly, right? So we'll hit, my hope is we get that snowball effect, right? And at some point things will go fairly quick. Yeah,
like having the future years at least a little bit cleaned up.
Yeah. Now, what offsets the future years to be, to help you understand is future year audits have not occurred. So that means the auditor has to come back and do a full audit. Okay. That's a whole process in itself, right? Typically the auditor's here about 2 weeks with a full staff, but leading up to that 2 weeks being on site, they usually have a pre-work that they do with us and on their own, right? And that may be 2 weeks to a month. Then on the back end of after being here, they go back and work some more. And once we get numbers where they need to be, then there's a whole process about getting the financial statements written up and getting them to where they can be issued. So it's actually, and I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand is, and why, like, Ben, why aren't you moving faster? Well, there's a process that has to go through because the auditor has auditing standards by which they have to abide by in order to maintain their credibility.
Yeah, I understand that.
If I had one,
I-
I'm
Sorry,
sorry, if
go
I
ahead.
had one ask for you, for a council member, is please do not underestimate the mess. And because I'm here, I also hear it from staff. Staff are asking the same thing. Why are we not done? Why are we not done? And it's one is understanding the audit process. Number two is underestimating the mess.
Thank you, Ben. I asked a lot of questions. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in.
I guess I'd like to add, that we're getting a lot of pressure from the community about the audits and our financial situation, in addition to our own concerns. And we'd like to commend you folks, for doing your best. I know it's a tough process, and we're all under the microscope, so to say, in this process. And I just like to thank you, Ben and Duncan and Chris and John. You're doing an outstanding job. Just keep it up, and we'd like to see you go faster and get it done, but it takes what it did. It takes its time.
I would just like to add that I think one of the things that might be helpful when you're speaking to members of the public and go, why isn't things done, is that understanding that the normal audit process, when things are well done, ready to go, is still a normally 3 to 6 month process. And when you're behind 4 years, you're already talking about a normal timeline, a 2-year process almost. And when you have a mess, it's even worse than that. So it's not something that you just can go in and say, oh, now we know what the problem is, throw numbers at it and be done. Because if they did that, there are funds that are related because of legislation. Dollars are supposed to go certain places. And that's what Ben and John are trying to make sure of, is that those dollars are in the right place so that the audits not only are complete and meet GASB, et cetera, but they can make you feel comfortable that those fund dollars are where they're supposed to be. So it's not just oh, we have the problem, we can do 4 audits all in the same time frame. It takes time.
Something that, this is Green, that also here is the district attorney, when things initially broke, when we learned from the former director of her indiscretion, and she came in with a lawyer and they talked, he was very disappointed when I disclosed, or John disclosed to council, that something bad had even happened. And he has directed us to not talk about it too much, because if we say something, it could create a proof problem or a defense that maybe wasn't there before we talked about it. And so when you're talking about real problem versus what it looks like is the problem, we have to be very careful, or there may not be a prosecution, there may not be a successful prosecution. There's some things out there that could, I'm just going to say, create reasonable doubt. And someone could say, well, prove she took it. Well, maybe you can't. I don't know. That being said, I was told by the DA that at least as to that small part of the problem, charges should be filed sometime in July or August. Right now, one of the problems, we can blame COVID for almost everything. I'm loving it. It's the universal excuse. There are no jury trials or criminal cases, jury trials in criminal cases or other cases right now until sometime in August. And so if you're charged with a criminal offense and you say not guilty, give me a jury trial, the law still says they got to bring you to trial within 6 months. And so there's going to be a whole lot of litigation about, did you bring me to trial correctly? Is COVID really excuse? This whole thing about these meetings like we're having right now is, there's no law about it. There's nothing. This has never happened. this technology's never existed. So there's not even anything to extrapolate it from. And these are all things which are causing us to not be able to just explain everything to everybody. Whether that makes it better or worse, I'm not sure, but that's been one of the pretty large impediments to, I guess the word everyone wants to use is transparency, because it might actually hurt the city instead of help it.
So basically, we can't get a speedy trial through.
The Supreme Court said that right now there's no jury trials until sometime in August, and they may extend it again, and that's because of the social distancing. Most of the court cases, especially civil, are on WebEx right now, and they're just starting to litigate whether that's legal or not. It's the same thing with electronic meetings for elected officials. There's really no authority for these anywhere in the state law. There's really no authority against them in the state law. So this is a whole new area, and my ilk is looking forward to making great money at it, and I'm just trying to keep us all out of trouble so we at least have done something that makes sense to a judge later on. So those are all the challenges besides the fact that the numbers don't add up or multiply or whatever they're supposed to. Like I say, you can blame COVID for a lot, or at least what people think is COVID.
Well, thank you for that, Mike.
You're welcome. And if you folks have any questions, call me, because I can talk to you individually, probably safer than in a meeting.
I just have a statement then. So regardless of the embezzlement, I feel like we owe a message to the public besides these meetings, you know, and whether the people from the public attend. So how can we update the public on where we are with the audits, what timeline we expect, and what stage the embezzlement case is in?
I think just what Ben has told you, that right now, based on information from our contractor, it looks like we can have this year's audit done by such and such a date. We can probably talk about that. About the embezzlement, it's not really our place to talk about it. It is the district attorney's. As soon as he files charges, then we can probably put out a press release. You know, like I say, he's called me once and chastised me mightily for talking about it, for telling my client. That was what was interesting. John and I disclosed it to council was all we did. And I get this phone call that, you know, you can't do this and blah, blah, blah. And it was an interesting discussion. But I can tell you things, but they're not for public consumption.
So it sounds like the soonest we could possibly even make a statement about the embezzlement would be August or later.
It might be sooner. I just need to see that charges have been filed. I kind of know where the DA's headed in the case, and so I can understand why he doesn't want us talking about it, because it could jeopardize his plans.
Can we at least tell people it's in his hands and ask him questions, or
Yes,
can we not even do that?
Yes, ma'am. You know, we're just witnesses. We're not in charge of the embezzlement prosecution. The CBI and the district attorney is. Please call the district attorney. I don't have a problem with that. That's the safer way. We're not in charge of this investigation. I think that's something else.
Yeah, we should make that explicit.
Yeah, kind of like the fireworks. We're not in charge. We're a participant, but it ain't our show. And so, I mean, that's what we could tell the people. Hey, the DA's in charge of this right now, and we have to follow his directives, guidance, whatever. And we're not in a position to be able to disclose a lot.
Thank you for answering all those questions.
Well, then back to Duncan then.
Let's continue.
Excellent discussion, certainly an extremely important item for your ongoing agenda here. Let's step back, take a deep breath, clear our minds, and focus on a particular question here. If I'm looking at effective municipal financial management, what are the core elements, a checklist? Do we have this? Do we not? What is the state of this particular element? Let's just do a laundry list. I'm not going to go in a lot of detail. This is the kind of thing we can come back in future discussions. But this is a checklist. An annual operations and capital budget. You bet. Your charter requires it. In fact, your charter requires a 5-year capital plan, excuse me. There's a difference in a capital plan and a capital budget. A plan looks out 5 years, but only the next year is the actual budget. You only appropriate typically for that budget year. So that's a distinction that will make more sense as you move through and get more experience in capital budgeting. Second item, again, a 5-year capital plan. It links to the capital budget. So as the 5-year plan rolls forward 1 year at a time, 1 year, the back end drops off, the front end moves forward 1 year. The first year in the 5-year plan becomes your budget, okay, for that particular year. So you have a budget document. Hopefully you will take it apart, you take it home, spend the time to learn and understand what's in that budget, starting with what are the services that this particular organizational unit delivers. If you don't understand what that organizational unit, the police department, the fire department, the library, the recreation department, the public works, if you don't understand what services they're delivering, frankly, I would question whether you can effectively form policies and priorities. So let's go over here back to the list. A statement of financial policies, a clear statement of what financial policies this organization is going to be following. Next, your accounting and financial reporting and documents, of course, and a focus on what is the financial condition of the organization. Financial condition is different from financial position. Financial position tells you basically what your financial report is going to tell you. That's what financial position is. Financial condition says, here's my report, how healthy am I? Okay, they're different metrics. And there is a whole literature of best practice, a set of starting documents that can, simple metrics that can tell you how healthy are we as the city of Cortez. It might have helped avoid the problem that we just discussed. Next. Treasury, investment, cash management, and debt management, a whole separate area to discuss. But best practice has, there's a list of best practices that are involved with this particular area. Next. Internal controls. Wow, biggie. There's a whole set of practices that are associated with what needs to be done in an organization to try to smoke out where there is malfeasance and where there is fraud going on. And it's an ongoing oversight kind of function that needs to be in place. And there's a list of best practices. Next. And of course, your annual audit. And we've already discussed what that audit is in general terms. Next. I'm sorry, yes?
Yeah, sounds great.
Was there a question? I'm sorry. Okay, we're good. So the concept here, and you've heard me say it over and over again, is about the concept called best practices. And these are codified. And basically they're developed through 2 organizations, particularly for cities. Governmental Finance Officers Association, which originally was called Municipal Finance Officers Association, and now it's become Government of Finance Officers Association. They have subgroups, practitioners who have developed and refined best practice sets in these particular areas on our checklist over here. And ICMA, and this is another group you need to become familiar with. the International City County Manager Association. Between the two, and they work very closely together, there is an extensive different list of best practices in the different areas we've been talking about.
Yeah, just right there.
Hey, oh, okay.
And so we've talked also about GASB and GAP already, so let's go to the next slide. All righty, here's a biggie. What are the roles and responsibilities between City Council and the city manager and staff? Let's step back a moment. What is the city manager form of government? There are three fundamental forms of government in the U.S. for local government. By local, I mean city, county, township, parish, those kinds of things. The most traditional, the oldest, is the commissioner form of government. We don't have that a whole lot left, although the state of Texas tends to have some of that. The commissioner form of government is a combination of the executive and the legislative function. Recall your civics, three fundamental functions in government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. In the commission form of government, you may have, for example, three commissioners in a geographic area, call it a county, and that is spatially divided into three different areas. And that commissioner sets the tax rates, sets the fees that are involved, and manages the roads and all the departments, et cetera. He or she is both the legislative and the executive function. This was quite common coming out of England in the old days, and certainly in the early part of the history of this country, but it is virtually dissolved and gone at this point in time. The second is the strong mayor form of government. This is typically where the mayor is elected as an elected CEO, and he or she is the executive, not the legislative, not the judiciary, but the executive, and sets policies and executes and controls, all three of those functions we talked about. The third is the city manager form of government. Anybody have an idea when the city manager form of government was first instituted? A guess? 1913, city of Dayton, Ohio. And there are probably several thousands now of cities and towns that use the city manager form of government. The city manager form of government differs from the strong mayor form of government in that the city council, that the city manager is the executive, the chief executive officer, and the city council sets policy and gives direction and vision. Doesn't mean they can't ask questions about what's going on down in the departments at the detail level, but the fundamental role is basically one of vision and direction and oversight. Oversight, okay? Now, the fundamental concept of the city manager form of government is that anytime you need to go to staff, you go through the city manager. Like it or not, that is the form of government that the city manager is about. Why? The problem that has emerged over time and in history with the strong mayor form of government is where you then had, in many cases, very large legislative bodies, is that the legislative bodies would try to go directly to the departments to assign duties for that department manager to do. I've got potholes on this particular street. I want you to send a crew out today. Well, if you get 7 different city councilors calling Phil over there to say, send a truck over here and fill these potholes, it's chaos, people. And it cannot happen in a city manager form of government without undermining the form of government. That does not mean that you can't ask questions and get clarity about what the operations are, et cetera, but that should be gone through the city manager. If you need to call directly, then that staff person should notify the city manager that you have made this request so that there is always the context in the CEO's office. It's up to the council and the city manager to make sure that the city manager form of government works. You have a city manager form of government by charter, okay? By charter. What is a charter? Anybody know what a charter is? A charter is the city's constitution. The charter is distinguished from an extension of the state. Without a charter, you would have no statutory rights except for what's done through general legislation and special legislation. I was county manager, deputy county manager in the state of Florida before we had home rule and charters for counties. And every single time we had to raise the fee, for example, for the dog pound to pick up a dog, we had to go to the special, to the legislative delegation, that is the state Congress and legislators and senators, and give them a list of things that we would like to do in that year. And then they had to go to the entire legislative body and pass a statute, authorize special legislation that authorized the county of Alachua or the county of Seminole to do this. It is entirely cumbersome because at that time, you, as the city or a town, you were simply an extension of the state. Home rule means you have sovereignty in effect, a limited sovereignty, limited to the charter. You don't need to go to the state to get this particular type of actions taken care of. You have been delegated and established that through the home rule concept in your area. Now, it's limited. There are certain things that are reserved to the state of Colorado that you can't do without legislation unless you do it within that legislation. But outside that, anything you need to do reasonably, you have the authority to do from the charter. But you also have obligations to fulfill within that charter. So the 4 new members, I would gently suggest read the freaking charter. Understand what's in the charter. And then make sure, please, that we're all on board with what is basically the city manager form of government. So basically, then let's look over here to the left. What does the city council do? Above all, no, wait a second. Above all, we want to affirm and set missions. What is this department supposed to be doing? What is its mission? And what are the goals? This is the vision concept. You're going to set financial policies. You are the policy. You're like the board in a not-for-profit organization or a corporation. Basically, you're looking at strategies. You're looking at the financial condition, again, that word, financial, or that term, financial health. You're looking at the big picture of what's going on. You're going to set priorities, and that's what the budget process is about. Your role is to take limited resources against unlimited needs and fit the two together. What did get into the budget and what didn't get into the budget and why. And then you're going to affirm and set levels of service. Chris was very clear on this. You can buy the cheapest Chevrolet or you can buy a Mercedes. They're both cars. That is a service level or a product level. But there's a huge difference in how much you're going to do and what comes with the car. So basically, levels of service are about what quality of services are going to be offered, what range, what depth, what breadth. And that has a huge impact on how much dollars or resources you're going to be associating to a particular department or organizational unit. You're then going to make those triage decisions. What is actually going to be appropriated by line item, by department unit? And above all, you are the oversight. You are the oversight over the whole. Are we accomplishing the mission? Exactly as Chris said earlier. Are we meeting the priorities? Are the outcomes of what we're investing in the Parks Department, in the Public Works Department, are the outcomes, the impacts on our community, are they what we want? These are what you're resolving. And then you hand them to the city manager to execute and do with oversight, monitoring all the time. Are we getting to where we wanted to go? The vision that you as a council have, is it being accomplished? All of which under due diligence and fiduciary responsibilities. What's a fiduciary responsibility? You are acting on behalf of the community, and you always have to keep that in the front. It's not about you, and it's not about your wealth or how you can gain from this. It's about acting as a fiduciary on behalf of the community. Now, what is the city manager about? Next. City manager is going to facilitate with you the missions and the goals, and facilitate policies, suggest policies that we need, suggest a starting discussion set of policies in areas that you want to move forward, suggest strategic actions and strategic issues, keep them on your radar, bring them to your radar. You know what the single most effective and important document in doing this kind of thing, particularly in executing things? It's your agenda. It's your weekly agenda. If it's not on the agenda, most likely action on that item is not going to happen. Think about it, because it takes authority from the board to cause something to happen. It needs to get on the agenda to move forward to get that authority. So a shrewd or smart city councilor is going to figure out how to work with the city manager in developing, and the city clerk in developing the agenda so that items that you want to discuss are on there, okay? So facilitate, 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 and then we get to the big word. The city manager executes through the staff, consistent with the budget, consistent with priorities. He or she is going to use their CEO authority to direct staff, to work with staff, to accomplish what it is you're trying to do in the mission and priorities and vision. Generate and maintain financial statements and control. Monitor, make sure that that bucket that we were talking about, the relationship to what's coming in, what's appropriated, and what's going out is being met, and then constantly looking at, is the quality of the service what we want? Is the business process that's in place to get there the very best and most efficient way that we can get there? Efficiency and effectiveness. Those are the two major outcomes that we're looking for. So there we go. You have the distinction between the two. And obviously, one more, next please. Obviously, there has to be a relationship, Ben. Obviously, there has to be a relationship between the two. It's a two-way street. Take the time, take your city manager to lunch. Talk to them about the ideas that you have. Talk to your fellow council members and develop the ideas that you have with them. But at the time you come in and put your hat on together, then it's about the council as a whole and as a body acting as fiduciary for the city and the benefit of the city. Questions, comments, wisecracks, whatever's relevant.
I have a question that maybe I should have asked on a different slide, but obviously some of our services run at a deficit, meaning, you know, fees don't cover them completely. So how do we know what a good threshold for that is? You know, say, okay, we want fees to cover 30% or 70%. You know, how do we know what best practices are for that?
Rachel, there really are no guidelines along. It is truly a value-based decision. You see where I'm coming from? It's what you as the board, as the council says, the values that we hold, looking at the revenues we have and looking at the needs that we have in the community. What is a fair and equitable, what is a feasible level that we can charge? So how important is that particular service and how much do we think is equitable for the individual to pay? And then what goes into the community pot that comes out of the general fund through the tax effort? And that's all the more guidance that I can give you. It's just basically your values and how the votes line up, basically, in context with everything else. How much revenues are we generating and what's the cost that we're looking at?
I would just add, I would add to that, Rachel, in that I think that's one of the questions you asked. I know years ago when I was in Parks and Recreation, council asked, and we ended up setting a guideline that, like adult recreation programs, adults paid full cost of what the program was. Youth programs were 50%. So essentially that was set up by council. I think that's a good question that if you're interested, council should begin to ask and just say, for those types of programs that are delivered to the individual or some type of specific type item, what's the return on them? And if you see them and you go, well, it's an adult program, we think adults should pay the full fee, why aren't we? And you could always change it. But I think that's one of the questions you could begin to ask is think about those programs or projects and ask departments to tell you what their returns are.
I think it also depends on what fund the service resides in. For example, if you're talking about a service that's in an enterprise fund, you actually expect it to cover itself.
Right.
Right. And we'll get to the funds differences a little bit later, but just think about that. And then I'd also say is, going back to Arlena's question earlier about meeting, is it worthwhile? This is one of those reasons why it is worthwhile, because you can then talk about, well, if we need to change our priorities or the goals, we need time in order to implement and affect that change.
I think, Rachel, that what's really at the heart of this is the two terms we talked about earlier, private good versus public good. Tennis lessons. To what extent is that tennis lesson only serving that individual recipient versus to what, if any, is there some benefit to the general community? Perhaps keeping young people off, giving them something to do, maybe 10 or 15% of the fee should be then considered public. Or it may be, no, this is entirely a private good and it should be 100% fee recovery. You see where I'm going? Public good, good for the whole community. Private good, I am personally the only one getting the benefit directly to me.
And when Duncan earlier talked about the cost accounting versus performance metrics, the cost accounting side of it would say, how much does that service actually cost? So you need to know exactly how much that tennis lesson cost, so you know how much to charge. The performance metric might be is this a community a goal and approach of ours, and are we doing X number of these to keep kids busy throughout the summer or whatever? They're slightly different.
Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just like to, before we move off this particular subject, I'd just like to add, today I asked the department heads to look over their fees and charges and get them updated. And I know we discussed it last year, and there were several that, well, gee, if we put them to where they belong, it's going to really outrage people because we haven't done it for so long. And that's something Ben and I have talked about, and that's something I want changed. Every year we should review them, and every year they should probably go up incrementally so that nobody gets hit all at once. That's something, again, to discuss with the council about, do you want to just put the stuff off indefinitely, or do you want to incrementally? It just, our cost, the cost, and it depends on whether you want to pay for itself or you want to subsidize it also. So, it's a lot of things to think about. Sorry, Duncan.
Thank you, John. Ben, next. Yeah. All right, we're going to go through this one quickly. What is a budget? Just balancing of revenues and expenditures, one year at a time. Go ahead. Management work plan, we've touched on that. Next, envision and prioritized outcomes. I'm not minimizing this. I know we're running out of time. It's multi-year contextual framework. Please, this is back to where we were. Don't do a budget within the context of just 1 year. Look out to the bigger picture. What's the context of the economy? What's the context of the community? What's the context of demographics? What's moving in? What's moving out? It's all contextual. Next. Adaptive. You modify as you go along and make changes, modify, literally taking it and reappropriating through a budget resolution, through a formal action by the board or the council, excuse me. Must be balanced. We've already talked about that. Projected revenues must always equal projected expenditures. It is the most effective document you will have to be able to make things happen. Okay, next. Who owns the budget? It's a legal document. The city council appropriates monies. It's a formal legal step or act. And of course, it's targeted to specified public purposes. In your charter, your budget is appropriated at the major organizational level. Okay, now that will mean more when you get into the budget, because you have what's called major line items, personnel, contracts, etc. There are basically 5 different major line items. Those line items are not part of the appropriation level. You're appropriating by your charter to the major division, and they can move the monies around according to the charter. Now, the city manager may say, no, you're not going to do that. That's a totally different thing. But basically, you're appropriating to the major organization and unit. Authorizes staff, this is a very important slide, to obligate the city by entering into contracts and other binding agreements. Go ahead. Raise revenues, this is the exaction that we were talking about, the legal mandate to do these. Expend monies, you're authorizing them to expend monies. Go ahead, within the budget amount, within the unit of the budget, and not exceed the appropriation, and bring budget amendments back so that you're constantly modifying and adapting according to incoming revenues against outgoing expenses. Next. Oh, here's the fun one. What are funds? These are the buckets that we're talking about. Next. This is because public sector money, I'm using it on behalf of the community. I'm exacting it through a tax where there's a penalty if you don't pay it. There's a much higher level of transparency required to do this than if it was a corporation. Funds help to identify where revenues come from and for what they are to be invested by a particular functional concept. Go ahead. They're separate buckets that are associated with revenues and expenditures. It's separately accounted for, and sometimes they have different accounting rules, so that a clear picture of the financial operations and a sense of outcome is provided for each bucket. Each bucket is like a separate set of financial statements. It's as if I had a major corporation and was doing a set of different financial statements for each of these different units. Go ahead. There are 11 types of funds. I knew you were looking forward to that one, weren't you? You're going to have to learn those 11 types of funds. And fortunately, they're divided into 3 major groups. There's general government. This is for street maintenance, for libraries, for parks and recreations, where there's services being provided across the community. Next. There are enterprise funds, and Ben talked about this earlier. That's where you have a function in the government that operates like a business. It's 100%, basically 100% revenue generating, and it delivers specific services to specific clients. And that would be the water department, the sewer department. If you had one, it would be the airport, those kinds of things that are fee generated, and they use private sector accounting rules, okay? That they're handled just like basically the private sector. Next. And then the fiduciary accounts. This is where you passing something through. If you're bringing in a grant on behalf of one of these non-governmental organizations, it simply is coming in, and it's in your hands a very short period, and then it's passed through to somebody else. That's called a fiduciary responsibility. You can have escrow accounts. You can have trust accounts where somebody's donated money, but they've put limits on it and said, maybe in their will, they've left money to the city, but it's to be used for a specific purpose. Or there's a house that's been dedicated to the city, and you're going to turn it into a museum, but you're waiting to do that as you move forward. Three fund groups: general government, enterprise, and fiduciary. And your budgets and your financial statements are all organized around this fund structure concept. make a lot more sense as you get your hands on it and start digging into it. Next. Key terms, programs, service, product lines, descriptions of the fundamental natures. This is what we talked about earlier. Each department, each organizational unit provides services. What are the services that are provided? If we don't know what the police department is actually doing, what the services are that the library is actually doing, you really can't make good decisions about how to manage it. So one of the first things you have to start with is understand what it is each of the departments do and what they don't do, okay? So that you understand then what levels of service and what services are provided. Next. Workload. This is the number of units of service by product or service line that is actually being delivered. If one of my service line is tennis lessons, then the workload is the number of tennis lessons that are given, okay? So there's a big difference if I'm having to provide 100 tennis lessons a day versus 10 lessons a day. This then determines or drives the amount of resources that have to be invested in that particular area. Now, you as the council can set workload sometimes. You can cut it off and say, well, we're only going to put 10 tennis lessons per week out there, and anybody else after that has to go on a sign-up list. You as a board or the council can make these decisions sometimes that affect workload. Others are set by state legislation or your charter. You're mandated to do certain things. Okay, next. But it doesn't necessarily clarify what level of service. So you can have a very high level of service, high quality, top end kind of things, or very minimal basic kinds of services. And that basically is about the quality, the nature of the content, the range of the service that's there. You as the council, when you make an appropriation, this is either explicit or implicit in the decision you do. So you can open the library in terms of operating hours and expand the operating hours. Your service is the operations, the services that the library is offering when it's open. But if you want a high level of service, you have longer hours, lower level of service, lower hours are less cost. Okay, and Rachel, this gets back to that discussion we were having earlier. It's a value-based kind of decision that we're talking about. Next, outcomes. This is the whole point of delivering services. Can I measure, did we actually accomplish what we set out to do? And how do I measure? How do I measure the quality of a police service or the quality of a fire service? What are the outcomes? What's the impact? That's the key word. What's the impact on the target audience that service is focused on? Next. Efficiency versus next, effectiveness. Effectiveness is the relationship to the outcome to the cost. Efficiency is simply what each unit costs. I can be highly efficient and very ineffective. If I'm a teacher, for example, it's extremely efficient to have one teacher per 100 students rather than one teacher per 10 students. But it's highly ineffective to have one teacher per 100 students. You see the distinction. Next. Here's the kind of questions that we would suggest you as a council need to be asking, particularly in the budget. Should we invest in more computers in the library? More computers per person would be a level of service kind of thing. If there are no computers, then it's a new service kind of question. Are we reaching all young people who request swimming lessons? Are life cycle costs of street maintenance reduced by paving a gravel street? Am I going to spend less over the long run to pave the gravel street than I am by running a grader over it every 2 or 3 weeks? Budgets represent investment. And I'll be blunt, I used to really jump on my people, my staff, when they would say the word spend. You are not, in my opinion, spending. You are investing. When you basically put $1 out there into a community service, think of it as an investment. As an investor, and what is the return on this particular investment? And basically the terms that are above are metrics for measuring the impact, the value of the investment, and as Chris said earlier, the return on investment. So these are fundamental best practice concepts. Go ahead. What are the different ways municipal budgets are prepared? We're coming to the close. I know this is breaking your heart, but we're coming to the close of this particular section. What are the different ways municipal budgets are prepared? All budgets basically at every unit of government are prepared at least on an organizational unit. That is, police are separate from fire, or separate from public works, or separate from the water department and the libraries, et cetera, the organizational unit. But within those organizational units, there is a standard list of major line items. And you'll get comfortable with those because every budget has the same standard categories of cost, so that you can then get your head around how to compare libraries to parks and recreation to streets and stuff. Next. The next level is a service line budgeting, where within the department, I then have 5 different service lines. Service lines are equivalent for services as product lines are to companies that produce products, okay? So service lines, what are the service lines of the library? What are the different services that they offer? And so that also then is a way to do budgeting, to drive it down within the library, break out each service line, and use the major line items that we're talking about for each of those service lines, so that you then get an understanding of what it costs us to offer this service at this level in our budget. Next. Continuation budgeting. Continuation budgeting says, I simply am taking what we did last year and pushing it forward. No new services, no reductions, and except for across the board cost of service living, a cost of utilities adjustment, a cost of gasoline, those kind of things. It's a continuation of where we have been in terms of priorities and in terms of levels of service. Next. Target budgeting simply says, this is particularly used in a reduction budget. We're looking at a 5% reduction as we move forward. Everybody's budget needs to, continuation budget comes into the city manager with a 5% reduction, and then we start discussions and negotiations from there. So there are targets that are assigned by the CEO down to the departments to bring their initial budgets in for starting the discussions of the budget cycle. Next. Planning and programming budgeting. This is a huge thing that came out of the 60s under McNamara. It's where you set plans and define programs, and programs run across departments, and basically then your vision meets these programs, and the departments are simply a mix of whatever it is down there, resources to accomplish these programs, and then you budget according to the programs. Next. Zero-based budgeting. This is the most unusual one. This says every year we start with that budget, police, fire, libraries, water, everybody at zero, and you have to defend every dollar that's invested and build that budget from scratch each year. This is used actually in the private sector too. Next. Performance budgeting. Performance budgeting is based on efficiency, effectiveness, workload, levels of service metrics. It's a sophisticated but very powerful technique, but it's something that you build into if you're going to go that way over a number of years to get there. Next. Vision, goals, and priority-based budgeting. This is basically what you're using right now, and that is saying, here you got a continuation budget, but we also have some priorities and some vision. When can we start moving additional things in as we move forward, even if we have to move some things out that are no longer as relevant as they used to be? It's driven by understanding a collective base for the priorities of the community. Next. Folks, it's been a trip. Really appreciate the interest and the time that you've spent in this. And if you have any questions that you think of later, by all means, please call me. I'll be glad to sit down with you over a cup, well, not over 6 feet apart on a cup of coffee and talk about whatever questions you have, or give me a call or whatever. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you.
The next section we're going into is Ben's going to discuss financial management and the city's administration initiative.
Hey, Chris, before we do, Duncan, are you still on?
Yes, I am.
Can we, while you guys are still here, can we plan for the next session? Because I did not finalize that with the council. And I wanted you two, Chris and Duncan here, so we can set a date and then we can make plans around it.
Sure.
What dates are, you're not available on Wednesdays, correct, Duncan?
I'm sorry?
You're not available on Wednesdays?
That's my fishing day, my fly fishing days.
Smart man.
Yes, I can make the adjustments around that as long as we plan it ahead.
I originally said this Thursday, July 2nd, but I believe there are several council members who couldn't make that day.
Does it have to be this week?
It doesn't have to be, except, you know, next week, say it'll be, the following week is the, and then I would like, if I can,
You're breaking up.
Trying to set a date.
and then the week of the 20th, I would like to try and schedule the county commissioners if we can. So we're, you know, kind of running out of time in July. But we could, what about Monday the 6th?
And part of the reason for it is later on the slides is like the budget timeline for council's review of the budget, that drafted budget to bring to you. So we need to try to give you the a better understanding and help provide tools that you need as we go into that budgeting. And that budgeting is scheduled, I think, for your review to start after, not next week, the week after, if I remember correctly.
How many people said they couldn't attend this Thursday?
I can't.
That was the work.
Would a Friday work? Would Friday work?
I have a Zoom call on Friday at 2.
I'm gonna be with my family the next 5 days, so I was hoping Monday. But otherwise, I can miss it and watch later and submit questions.
I'm open Monday.
Thursday's fun.
Thursday or Monday is okay with me.
Orly,
Yeah, Mondays don't work for me.
they don't?
No.
What about Thursday?
Could we do next Wednesday?
No. Say that I've got a meeting that night.
No, I won't be available that night, no.
Wednesdays are not good.
Can we do a doodle poll and find out?
If I can find somebody to do that.
I can set up a doodle poll if that works.
Okay.
Yeah, I can do
That's a
that.
good idea.
Okay, so then we can find the day that has the most availability, and then whoever can't show up, they'll just have to watch the recording and submit their questions. Sound good?
It sounds good. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank
I'll
you,
send a
Arlene.
doodle poll. Yeah. Okay, let me write down an action item.
Just remember, Friday is July 3rd. I think most people have that day off.
Yeah,
Right.
Right.
that's right.
That was a selfish comment, by the way.
That's all I have. Thanks, everybody. You want to take 15 minutes, Ben?
Yeah, we can take 15 minutes, go through it.
Off at 9 o'clock is all I know, or I'm told.
Well, like I said earlier, I think the meeting's scheduled until 3 at least, so I can talk for another 6 hours, I'm sure.
Oh, I don't think.
To yourself, Ben?
So I think the next set of slides is to try to put some of the context around what we're actually doing here today, okay? So to start us off is what's on our radar, and create a map and kind of where are we at and why are we at here? And as you heard Chris talk about, it sounded like there was some pretty good discipline and some best practices that were performed up to a certain period of time. And then for some reason, those activities dissipated. They just stopped. Who knows why? And where we're at now is we're kind of creating a lot of new a lot of these best practices from scratch again. Okay. And that's evident by the audits not being complete, which we've talked about, right? It's also evident by the fraud having occurred, right? Because as Duncan talked about earlier, is having controls in place for your environment. So there's a lot of controls that we had to come back in, relook at, re-implement, do over. We have a lot of things that we need to do to work us towards best practices. And as I talked about earlier, as I did create a roadmap at one point last year, and I shared it with council a couple times, and as I said, my eyes are probably bigger than my stomach because there's so much that we can do, and a lot of things that would really be beneficial, and that can help us progress to best practices. One thing I'll say is it takes time, and we are on that adventure. It started last year, really, I think, with that budget. And if you read the 2023 budget, that first section was really talking about this is a journey, and that's what we're on. That's what we're doing. And it's like you talk about this picture on the car on the bottom, right? You have a car, you drive it along, it breaks down, because you didn't maintain it, or you did maintain it. Bad luck, who knows? You got to get it fixed. You can't get it fixed. You get a new car and you drive on, but you still got to maintain that car again in the future, right? So we're kind of it's kind of what we're doing. We were driving along somewhere, something's broke. They got to be fixed. Now, what do we fix? How do we fix it and move on to a good situation? Here's an example. So like our budget, I don't know if any of you have had a chance to look at prior to last year what the budget had looked like. We are now, this is a step to get us to best practices. One of the best practices for a budget is to have a GFOA approved or certified budget, okay? What that means is you create a budget that follows hits all these checklist type items, okay? And then what you can do is if you hit them all, you can submit it to the GFOA. GFOA will review it, and they'll give you an award, like a budget award. Say, hey, look, it's kind of certifying that you followed best practices for establishing your budget and creating your budget. Our budget is a step towards that direction. As you can see here, we have it categorized by the funds, by the departments within the funds. We're providing a lot more detail than I believe that's been provided than what's been provided in before. So, and a lot of it is in the sense of just transparency, not just for you, but also for the community, okay? And here's an example of, within the general fund, we had the expenditures by department, and here we're looking at city council, right? So we got our city council there to easily, in every section, for every department looks the same, okay? This is a living document in my mind. Every year we are going to improve upon it, okay? There are already changes for this year that'll look different when we bring this to you. And part of it is because we're improving in incremental steps our budgeting process. So we have that department name, have a brief description of the department, but also what service, ideally was we have what services that department provides, right? So if you look at, let's say public works, right? So what is public works services within the general fund? What are they providing out of the general fund? You should be able to identify those services here. These are areas we need to improve upon because we could always elaborate and expand on what those services are by department, okay? And then that's how you can get then into performance metrics and performance measurement. How is a department delivering on the services with a certain level of service quality for what are the priorities of the city? And then we have here, these are your major line item summaries. And I apologize, sometimes I go back and forth between like corporate world and public because my background is more corporate. And so on the left-hand side where you see your expenditures, I call those cost categories because it's pretty easy to think about it. If you want to rename it, we can call it investment categories. This is where our dollars as a city are being invested in, okay? So you have personnel services, charges and services, materials and supplies, intergovernmental capital, and so on. These were all kind of revamped last year, to be consistent with what GFOA naming conventions are, right? And part of that is because if you move from one municipality to another, or you want to compare yourself to a like municipality, you can get an idea how much you're investing in that category.
Yeah. GFOA, remind everybody what GFOA is.
Yeah, so GFOA, again, is the Government Finance Officers Association. They are a association which we are a member of that help provide best practices to municipalities. So that way, as a finance director, I don't have to make them up. I can go to a set of best practices, pull them off the shelf. Granted, it's not that easy, but pull them off the shelf and start trying to follow them. Okay, and it's also a mechanism by if you are a individual who's well versed in those, and by the way, I don't expect you to, you could ask, hey Ben, why are we not doing XYZ? Because that is a GFOA practice. And I can say, oh, I didn't know about it, or yeah, we can do that, right? We can at least have the conversation. And then down below, what we show here is the increase or decrease to the various cost categories, okay? And that's to show, hey, why did personnel services go up, or why did it go down, right? That was brand new last year. Something else that you'll see, if you looked at prior budgets, when you look at these major line item summaries, the way it was provided to council was at account level or line item, right? So it'd be this account number with this budget, this account number with this budget, this account number, and so on and so on and so on. That's very unruly in my mind. And it also does not provide you all with context in the story of where we're investing our monies. So here Duncan talked about there's a difference between investments, your funds versus the organizational structure, okay? And here is a structure of our funds, okay? The governmental funds over on the right-hand side, proprietary funds on the left-hand side. And within there, we have our enterprise funds. If you remember, those are funds that are to be operating like a business. We expect the revenues to cover the disbursements, right? So, and in there, you probably recognize quite a few of them. The internal service funds here are those funds that we provide and consume within the city. It's a service we're providing to ourselves. So I think it's kind of understanding, if you look at technology, the city provides our own technology. So what we do is we capture all those costs associated to that fund, and then we know how much IT or information technology costs us and how much we need to allocate and share to all the other funds. Okay, so we know how much is consumed. And that's a mechanism by which you can say, okay, how much is our health insurance costing? How much is our shop costing? And then it helps you all from your chair to say, hey, what are we spending on in here? Is the service level reasonable? Are we paying enough? Are we not paying enough? It allows you to help look at it in a different context. On the right-hand side, then, are what we're calling our special revenue funds. And as you heard Duncan talk about the, what was it called? Your fiduciary fund. And he talked about trust funds with escrows, like a pass-through of money. Our conservation trust fund is that. What that is, you know, if you go buy a lottery ticket, it goes into a lottery at the state level. And then what the state does is they allocate those lottery monies throughout the state to various municipalities for the municipalities to use for eligible recreation activities, programs, and costs. Okay, and then we have our equipment fund, lodgers tax funds. That's like, for example, all of the lodgers taxes that we, that get charged by the hotels and motels. All those revenues go into the lodgers tax. Okay, and of course, if you go into the budget, there'll be a description for each of these funds, what they are and what they're doing, right? So if you have a question, hey, what is the equipment fund really doing, or what's the lodgers tax fund really doing? You can go into the budget, read a little blurb about what it is. You can then see, okay, here's the revenues. Revenues are coming from lodgers tax. We do have a little bit of miscellaneous that comes in. What is that? You know, should help you understand what that is. And then what are we dispersing those monies? Where does the lodgers tax monies go? What are we doing with that?
If I could, right there, the special revenue fund is extremely important. simply because those revenues are strictly limited to a specific purpose. You cannot use it for anything other than the purpose of the special revenue fund. Make sense?
As an example, the Conservation Trust Fund can go for recreation, parks projects, but it cannot be spent for personnel or equipment. So there may be guidelines for each of these set by legislation at some point.
And then we were talking about the organizational structure, and as we were saying, is the budget doesn't necessarily follow the organization. It follows the funds, right? So this gives you an idea then of our organizational structure for the city based off of department, so to speak, right? So citizens at the top, of course, who you all report to. So yes, you have a boss. If you don't think you do, you do, right? You all know that. But then, the city manager reporting to the city council, as Duncan elaborated on before, right? And then all your different departments and the department heads below there. And then you have your city attorney who, reports to you all. The municipal judge technically is appointed by you all, I believe, therefore reports to you. And then your boards and commissions, you all have oversight into the boards and commissions. But when like a Parks and Rec, like there's the Parks and Rec Forestry Board, Dean provides information to them because they're an advisory council. But at the end of the day, like Dean actually reports to John as a city manager, right? So he has like maybe I don't want to call it a dotted line, but he has an additional level of oversight over Parks and Rec and how it's running because of that. Same thing with historic preservation, is providing a level of oversight over that function or service that we're providing.
And if you take a look at the city code, you will see where the city council appoints these different boards. They hire the city manager, the city attorney, municipal judge. And then when you read the code also, it talks about the city manager, and the city manager actually hires and communicates and directs all of the other department heads. So there are strict lines of the way people are supposed to communicate and who they are responsible to. Just like Ben said, Dean's responsible to John. He's not necessarily responsible to you because he's receiving direction from John. But that is based on direction from council by setting budgets, etc.
It's the chain of command.
Chain of command, that is correct.
Right.
I have one question. The cultural center, I noticed that's not listed under the boards and commissions. How is that allocated?
I don't know.
The cultural center is not of the city, and the boards that you appoint to things like a park and recs board, a forestry board, the golf course board, the library board, they run totally city functions. We appoint people to other boards that we don't control because for some reason, either legislatively or by agreement, we're on there. It's in some ways to account for the money you're spending on those boards. You've got a board member in there who's got access to see what's going on. It's also some control for your money, but yet it's not total control. It's a set of different boards.
For example, I think two examples that come to mind very quickly is if you look at Korea, or actually let's use Mesa Verde Country, for example, okay? Majority of the lodgers tax funds go to Mesa Verde Country, about 75, 80%, somewhere in there, I forget exactly top of my head, funds Mesa Verde Country out of the lodgers tax. You all, I believe, a council member is on that board. And it's to do exactly as what Mike Green had said, is provides a level of oversight that then city monies are being used in everything Duncan had talked about, right? The effective, efficient manner. Is it the right service lines, so there's some oversight there.
And that's exactly the same thing for the Cultural Center Board.
Thank you.
Here's an example of something that was new last year that I provided to council. And what it's doing is it's showing your fund balance projections, okay? And just looking at the general, it's broken out by fund types: operating, enterprise, internal service, special revenues. We look at the general fund right here at the very top line there. It gives you a quick side-by-side comparison. If you see estimated revenues versus your expenditures, okay, this is for 2019. And then what your net projected fund balance is. As John and I have said and reiterated mostly, and I know you all understand it, is we don't know what this beginning fund balance is, right? Right now, it's kind of a shot in the dark because of the audits are missing. We don't have validation of what's really there. But what's interesting is if you looked, when I initially did this last year, I talked to one or two council members just on the side, said, hey, I don't know if you're aware, when you passed the 2019 budget, you were in a deficit of about $300,000. Because if you see 13.3 versus 13.6, about a difference of 300K. It's okay, assuming you had a fund balance, because your fund balance would cover that gap, okay? But the question is, was your intent to be balanced? Was your intent to have a surplus? Was your intent to have a deficit? It's what your intent is. There's nothing wrong with being deficit, as long as you know why. So when John and I started last year, you'll notice our revenues and expenditures, they're balanced. Okay, they're buck off. That's because of rounding within the system. So give me the buck. It's balanced, 0. But that was intentional because we didn't know what the fund balance is. So John had provided guidance at that time last year was we need to balance our budget so that way revenues match expenses. We don't want to necessarily add to the hole, but we also don't want to dig the hole deeper. Okay, so this was a new view. There's quite a few new views that I added, new presentations of the financials that I've added to provide just new ways of looking at the information in another way that's transparent. So how are we proceeding this year? This is something like right now, I'll tell you, last year we kind of started from a zero-based budgeting because of the confidence in how budgeting was done prior. And we really wanted to justify every line item of spend, okay? This year though, was much more, it started out as a continuation budget, right? It took last year's approved budget and just moved it over to this year. Some people incremented for cost adjustments, like cost of living adjustments. So we did merit, assumed merit would be paid out. Sometimes your contracts have an automatic percentage increase year over year, like a 1 or 5%. So that was all included. This is where you all can help and get in is, okay, what are your vision goals and base priority budgets? How do you want to affect the budgeting process? John, do you have any comments here you want to add, or Claire, about the budgeting process for this year?
Oh, I think, am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're good now.
Yeah, I turned into a pumpkin at 9 o'clock, so what am I paying attention to? No, he covered it good.
Okay.
We just need direction on where to go from here.
Mm-hmm. You know, right now, John and I are working hard facilitating the budget process, but what's coming right now is, as John's mentioned before, is for 2021 budget, we're still looking at a deficit. So a guidance will be needed is, do you want to operate in a deficit? Do you want it balanced? Do you want a surplus? However we decide to go means you're giving something else up in return, right? So if you want a balanced budget and we have, say, $600,000 deficit we have to manage, that means we have to, you have to give something up, either a service or a level of service. Okay. Are there any questions about this before I move on to the next slide? Okay. I also wanted to give you a little context of like how the budget's developed and created. And because it did,
Excuse me a minute, Ben.
yeah, Sue.
I don't mean to, but I am going to have to leave now, so
I'll try and wrap
I'm
up
going to have
quickly.
to shut.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you, Sue. For the rest of you, I'll try to wrap up quickly. So what this was a new way to show, started with council last year, and I think it's still good for you all to show like, hey, look, we have all these inputs that come into creating our budget, right? You have your constituents, council priorities, the department needs, trends, budget versus actuals, your economic trends. You know, COVID is hit, we have to readjust. If there's recession, we have to readjust. Or maybe, hey, for some reason, revenues are coming in wonderfully. So how do we readjust? And then everything fills into like budget templates that we have created. They all get loaded into Cassell. And then what pops out then at the end, oversimplified, is your budget document for you. Along the way there are little stoplights, kind of controls along the way to help manage that budget. So initially, this first initial control, I look at that as kind of the financial administration internally. So that would be like myself and John looking at the budgets and providing guidance and suggestions like, hey, can you cut some more? Or, hey, you forgot something, right? It's another set of eyes. And then the final line here is the council's approval, right? Something to not overlook is it's a living document, as we talked about before. It may need to go back through the whole process in iterations. And then you all, in your role, you are that oversight and control component, right? What's the budget? How's the budget? Are we adhering to budget as we go? So here's the budget timeline that I talked about before, that was given to I think you all at one point in time, but also to staff. So where we're at right now is in the city manager and department revisions. We had a large meeting today to try and get the budget down to a balanced, not successful. So we, at least not yet. So we're still working on that, but yep. Okay. And then after we get some of these changes that we talked about today, John will review it one more time, and then we want to give it to council for your initial review, okay? A lot of this time frame is moved up from where it was last year. Last year, we got up to like the last minute, and it was, frankly, it was a little unfair, I think, for council. It's kind of like, here you go, go on with it. Don't make any changes because we don't have time. You know, so this year what we're trying to do is provide that time for you all to have a quality review, for you all to make recommendations and changes, for it to come back for us to actually apply those changes if there are any, okay? And make revisions as need be to then consolidate the budgets and get it back out to council for another review and then for a final approval, okay? So there are also timelines and dates that are set by the state on when we need to have things done. We are way ahead of these timelines, but part of it is also to give you all ample opportunity to be engaged through the process. And there we go. So I think last slide, is that for you, Chris?
Yes, we're finally to the key takeaway points. Essentially, a summary of these is that we've provided an introduction to information concerning the budget. Next. And the process, the procedures, service levels. Next. Talk about need for goals and objectives from council. Next. That the budget is a management plan and it integrates department activity with the framework that we're trying to move to. Next. And it's a legal obligation of staff not to exceed the appropriated amounts, and that it assures that the necessary modifications throughout the year are appropriately made. So it gives you the opportunity, that you can make changes. If things change, you need to be able to have the flexibility to change along with them. Next, and the city council is responsible for oversight of this budget. These are the primary takeaways that we hope you were able to get out of this evening's presentation, along with a little additional information, some background stories, some guidance, some thoughts, information that give you a little more base so that you can begin to ask questions, that you can give it more thought. You know, why are we doing this? Why aren't we doing this? Why can't we do this? You know, and to begin to think about, okay, we're getting a base. Where are we going next year? Things to talk about when you do your retreat and you start looking at where are we going? Are we going the direction that the previous council established, based on what they heard from the council before that, based on what was heard from the council before that? Have things changed sufficiently that you need to change direction? Or do we need to upgrade services? So anyway, we were just trying to get you an opportunity to ask questions and to provide some background knowledge as you move into this budget season. So with that, I would open it to any additional questions or comments. Or to say goodnight.
I just want to say thank you, Chris, Ben, and Duncan, for just so eloquently explaining all of this stuff. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I thank you also.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
We suggest
and Duncan and John and council.
Sorry, John too. I didn't mean to forget you.
He's still there. He hasn't turned into a pumpkin yet.
Except for get Mike Green too.
Well, I guess what we'll kind of await is Arlena getting a Google poll out so we can check and see what the next date might be, so that we can next, if you would, Ben. Or is that, yeah. So that we can discuss and go into work session number 2, which we start talking about priority-based 2021 budget, getting down in the weeds and looking at some of the takeaway points again there. And if there's anything in particular that you would like to see us address in addition to some of the things right here, please let John know and he can pass it on to us, and Duncan and I can look into that some more. But if we get a date, then we can begin to take a look at the next session.
Okay. And I'm sending that email like right after we end this. So
great.
So it'll be at least for all the council members, and then John, if you want to pass it on to Chris and Duncan and whoever else is coming.
Duncan, you got a comment?
just wanted to mention that this document is meant to be a reference document, so that you might want to print it and put it on your desk. And as you go through the budget, as you read this time and time again, different points will settle in and say, oh, this makes more sense. This makes more sense. So it's a context document.
I think Linda sent out a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation to all council earlier today. So
Linda can print out slides of these also,
yep,
which helps me.
And with that, I'll turn it over to John, I guess.
I just say good night, everybody, and thank you for attending, and thank you, Chris, Duncan, and Ben, for this fine presentation.
Okay.
I hope it's strange. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Have a good
Good
evening.
night, all.